So I can sneak away quickly. Nobody can see me.
All right. I'll get the tablets and I'll hand it.
Is Victor on? Jen? I need the Wi-Fi password.
Serena, did you take your packet from the other day?
Monday?
Yes.
No, I wasn't here Monday.
Okay, so
Monday.
that's why I have it.
Yes, please. Daniel, I need the Wi-Fi password. Can you call me? Oh, well, I can't check my email because. Yeah, I do. I do. Yeah, if you could send me an email, that'll work. Okay, thank you.
I'll have your board one. I'm gonna make some copies. You have one.
Monday? No, that's the finance one. I have my finance.
Okay.
An extra one, I guess. Yes, coming down.
I was gonna go get my energy drink. But I don't want to get
Energy drinks. Gosh, I can't drink caffeine this week.
I drink it all day.
It's only for like emergencies.
You're the attendance coach?
Yes.
Oh, welcome aboard. What's your name?
Denise.
Serena. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Oh, there's no phone.
Right there. Or
For my cord. Let me see.
You guys want some water? So can you want one?
Sure. All right.
I thought she was.
Well, Elizabeth?
Uh-huh.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Should I text her?
Is there? Maybe I do want to switch. How's your school year going?
Okay.
What grade are you doing?
First grade.
How many kiddos do?
I started with 21 and I'm down to 19.
Oh gosh, that's a lot of first graders.
Thank you.
I have 26 graders and I'm like, there's so many of them. Hey, sorry, can you step over my cord?
No, I'm gonna check.
Well,
The
you
likelihood
can't
of that
sue
is
me,
very
so.
high. Okay.
Well, if Elizabeth doesn't come, I might just.
Liz isn't gonna come, she's gonna join us. Oops, let's see, I just got a text from her. I'm on Google Meet, but no one else is there.
Oh,
Okay,
she might be in the.
are we on the camera?
Yeah, she's not up there. She might be in the wrong one.
Okay. Daniel or Victor, can you check with Lisa? She's on Google Meet and she doesn't see anybody else on this.
I have one.
So that's gonna be Elizabeth. She's not coming in.
Okay, can you send her the link?
Do you mind just throwing this?
Okay.
Thank you so much.
You have one, David?
Okay. Then call
Mr.
to
Board
order.
President, do you mind if we go through the board norms?
Okay, sure. Actively listen to all perspectives.
Close the loop, responding to concerns and questions as a unified board.
Model the professionalism we expect from all members of the district and community, customer service orientation.
Assume positive intent.
Be positive and responsive.
Thank you.
Okay, it is now 5:05 and calling the meeting to order. Do a roll call of the member. One member is still trying to get on, but Mr. Terrazas,
Present.
Ms. Begay,
Present.
Ms. Murillo,
Present.
and myself, Wadiana. I'm present. Soon we shall have Ms. Dean, and we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I salute the flag of the state of New Mexico, the Dia symbol of perfect friendship among united cultures.
Okay. I'd like to call this meeting to order, and I'd like to welcome our guest, Secretary Steinhaus, I'm sorry, and President of the New Mexico School Board Association, Mr. Joe Guillen. Welcome, and this will be a training session. As I said, one member still isn't on, but we can proceed. I'm sure they're working on that. That'll be remedied soon. So, Mr. Steinhaus, do you have any opening statements?
I say good evening and welcome. How's everybody doing tonight?
We're doing very well.
Good. I just wanted to, first of all, and as strongly as possible, say thank you to you for serving as a school board member. You've got important work to do, and you're volunteering your valuable time. And I know that sometimes it can be a real positive benefit for you because you get to be involved in making decisions for the school district. You get to set the budget for the school district. You get to set policies and the strategic plan. So all those things, as a former superintendent, I know are extremely important. And I know that you've got a brand new superintendent. So one of the questions you might think about asking him in this training is, what do you need, Dr. Spillett, to help succeed with the Cobre schools? And then last thing is, I know you've got this in your set of meeting rules, is to make sure that all of us focus first and every day on what's best for children. And with that, I know this is your training session, so I won't take a lot of your time, but I am happy to answer any questions. If you've got questions, we released new information about COVID today, and it's official. It's now a local school board decision on whether you want to require masks, local school board decision on whether you want to do any testing, and local school board decision on whether you want to require any kind of quarantine if somebody's exposed. And you no longer have to participate in the test to stay program to keep kids involved in activities and sports. So that's a real plus, and I've worked really hard to get that approved and very happy about that. And with that, Mr. President, be happy to answer any questions or turn the mic over to Executive Director Joe Guillen.
Do we have any questions that we'd like to ask Secretary?
I have a question. Small funding. It's being phased out, but I know this is negatively impacting a lot of schools because they don't have enough funding to keep running. Is there a plan in place to help those schools?
Let's see, I couldn't hear, it was cutting in and out. I did hear, is there a plan in place? But that's all I heard. Sorry about that.
The small school funding, I know it's being phased out. But a lot of small schools are really struggling. I think we're on the 3rd year of the phase out, and they're really struggling with the decreases that have occurred. And with it being eliminated next year, I know small schools are worried about how they're going to make the budget. So are there any plans in place to remedy that?
Yes, and I really thank you for bringing that issue up. As a superintendent, just a year ago in a small district, we were faced with the same thing, the phase out of that adjustment. And that's a decision that's not made by the Public Education Department. That's made by the New Mexico legislature. So please help me in talking to the legislature as we move into this next session and get them to work with us to accept our recommendation. We're going to be recommending an increase for small districts and rural districts because it's just impossible to try to meet all the expectations out there, and there just isn't enough money. So I think you're right in asking about it and being concerned about it, and I'd like to work and stand shoulder to shoulder with you and anybody else that wants to correct that problem.
We have a funding shortage in terms of what we paid for the ELT days that were done this year. The calculation was based on the full 160 to 180 days, and we have a 4-day week. So that's actually that lessened the amount that we received because our calendar year is 164 days. Is there any, we're exploring possibilities for securing the full amount that we should receive based on the number of days. Do you have any suggestions?
Yep, I think we can get that fixed. Thanks for asking. Antonio Ortiz is the person to talk with to get that corrected. And I think we can get that corrected for you and make sure that you get reimbursed for the exact amount. And yes, since you're on a full 4-day week, the calculation is a little bit different, but you should still get reimbursed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for participating in the LTP.
Our pleasure. We have one more question. And also, Ms. Dean has joined in. Ms. Dean, do you have any questions?
Hi, good evening. At the moment, I don't.
Okay. No other questions? Okay.
Okay, so I'm on 2 finance committees. That's why I'm asking finance questions. The SEG unit increase for both of the schools I'm on the finance committee for has not been enough to cover the pay raises that are expected. Is there any plan? Do you control that, the SEG, or is that controlled by another entity?
Yeah, all the funding is controlled by the New Mexico legislature. And so they're the ones that set the SEG amount. And yeah, I'll tell you what happens. In Santa Fe, the legislative staff do these calculations that are a statewide average. And that works when you look statewide. But then when you split the money up and you look at just the Cobre schools, that's when it looks like there's shortages. So that'd be another thing that I will make sure I communicate that with the Legislative Finance Committee and members of the New Mexico legislature. And I'd encourage you to also talk with your local legislators to make sure they're aware of those challenges. And it seems like it's happened to Cobre 2 or 3 years in a row. So we need to get that fixed.
And we have 2 educators on the board. So I'm a teacher and Mrs. Begay is a teacher. Mrs. Dean was a teacher, so she's a former educator. So I just wanted, I think that's kind of neat that we have teachers who are in the classroom on our board. The assessments that we're taking in the spring when should we expect those results to come in?
It cut out again. Did you ask about testing scores?
Right, the test that the students took in the spring.
Yeah, I'm really happy to report that I went back to the company and said, we cannot wait until September, October to get that results back. And they agreed to send them to us earlier. So we're going to have them here in about a week and a half to send out to you. And it'll be student level data as well as school and district level data. And that's just this year because it's a brand new test. And then from this, starting next year, you'll get the test results within 10 days.
Very
So
nice.
you won't have to wait.
Very good.
All right, thank you for answering all my questions.
I'm happy to. And your superintendent's got a memo that I sent him about the testing data and when it's going to be released. So you might ask him to forward that to you, but that's got more details of what I just said. But I gave you the information, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for being educators on the school board.
Thank you. Mr. Guillen, well, it's now your show. We can't, Victor, we can't hear him.
Oh, they're in.
Mike's off,
Okay.
Joe.
Yeah, I think it would help if I turned on the mic, so I'm sorry about that. But I just wanted to thank you for inviting us to be here. I wanted to share my invitation with Dr. Steinhaus and make sure he got an opportunity to meet you all and congratulate you on your appointment as I would like to do. You have 3 new board members and 2 new officers and a new superintendent, so we're pleased to be able to come to you and provide any assistance that we can in making your job as easy as possible. So just a short note on the Nmsba. Many of you know we have all of our school boards are members of Nmsba. We have 450 school board members across the state. And we primarily try to give you support, information, and training, again, to help you keep up with the very complex and very numerous rules and regulations that schools are required to adhere to. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and start with, I thought we would do a couple of things. First is do a basic orientation on school board service, and then get into board superintendent relations and the responsibilities of each there. Thought that might be a good place to start. I'd like to go through this as quickly as possible and then allow you any time for questions. So I just want to make sure before we get started here how to access the presentations. Is your tech person there? They said they would give me access to share my screen.
Daniel. Can you give Mr. Guillen access to share screen, please? Can you walk him through it?
Yes. Uh-huh. Okay, it says present now. Is that the one? Okay. All right. Maybe we don't want the. Can you see the screen at this point?
No, sir.
Okay. Let me cancel and It's giving me a option of your entire screen or window. Okay, maybe this way.
Okay.
Okay, can you see that now?
No, it's too small. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Okay, we can see you now, Mr. Guillen. I mean, we
Okay.
can see the screen now.
Okay, I can't see you. I can see my screen now, but we'll just go through this, and if you have any questions, just stop me as we go forward.
Okay,
That would be all right.
Let me check with Miss Jean, see if she can see it. Can you see it, Lisa?
Yes, I can. It's clear.
Okay, then
Thank
we're
you.
good. Please proceed, Mr. Guillen.
Okay, thank you. This orientation will include several things, and it'll first ask you some questions about school board service and what your impression is of it. And we'll go through the statutory powers and duties, and then the regulatory powers and duties, some of the key roles and the code of ethics, and then a little bit about individual authority. So as you all have realized, as once you became a board member, it puts you in the public eye. People are looking at you a little differently in the grocery store and wherever you go. So as you know, be aware of that. School board service is very important, and across the country, there's about 14 or 15,000 school boards throughout the country, including 89, of course, in New Mexico. And most school board members are volunteers. It's a few states that pay a small salary, but of course not in New Mexico. You all direct a lot of the expenditures of funds. You oversee administrators and teachers and preside over buildings that are valued. And you do this all for the 50 million children across the country. We don't like to see single issue school board members. There are so many issues that we deal with at the school board level, as you know, that it's very it's not good to be harper or focus on one issue only. You can tell that person was focusing on sports only. So a couple of questions for you as you move forward in your service. Do you have a vision for your community and the school district with high expectations for all students? Or did you run or indicate your interest for the board to advance your special program or interest? Another question here.
It's a response. You're asking? Yeah.
Just, do you advocate for all children play an active role in the community leadership, develop partnerships, and expand resources? Or do you want to ensure that your child has a place on the football team, hire friends, fire the superintendent, or have political power?
Well, I taught in the Cobre School District for a few years, and so my decision to run was based off what I saw in the district and room for improvement and our children and our families and our community. So that's why I ran for school board.
Yeah, and these aren't questions for you to answer. We're just to reflect on. There are so many,
No, but
there are so many, we ask these questions when you're candidates and also as you begin to take office, just to show the comparison. So are you committed to teamwork, collaboration with your colleagues, the superintendent and others to achieve your district's vision? Or do you perceive your role as a outside agitator on the inside, hoping to create controversy or turmoil? We'll go on to the next question here. Do you base your decisions relative to the district's vision, mission, and goals? Or do you make decisions on the basis of personal, political, or special interest demands? And then I think this is the last one here. Do you commit the necessary time to perform your responsibilities and increase your knowledge and skills to become an effective board member? Or do you assume that the voters are happy with the knowledge and skills you have when you filled the position or filed for election? So, you know, learning the basics as you're finding out of school board service can be very stressful. So I'd like to get into the actually statutory powers and duties that you have as a school board member. And the first 3 or 4 are the most important. Developing educational policies for the district. You know that you all have district policies, and I think you're reviewing them at this time. So those are very important to set the groundwork for the operation of your district. Number 2, you're employing a superintendent and setting the salary. These are statutory mandates that you have. So you've recently employed a new superintendent, you've set a salary, and you're working together and moving forward. Then the next important responsibility is reviewing and approving the district budget. The budget serves as a guide for all the operations and expenditures in your district, and it's very important. So those 3 items are the most important. But in addition to those 3 important items, you have the responsibility to acquire, lease, and dispose of any property that the district owns or wants to own. You have the capacity to sue and to be sued. And you also have the statutory authority to acquire property by eminent domain or by condemnation, just like cities and counties do. You also have the responsibility to issue general obligation bonds, any of your bonds. If you go out to a bond issue, that is your decision, and it should be based on, of course, the needs in your district. And then some other property type responsibilities: provide for the repair and maintenance of district property. You can subpoena witnesses and documents, particularly if you're involved in any lawsuits. Except for salaries, you're responsible for contracting for expenditures via the procurement code. So you need to ensure that your district is following the procurement code on all contracts. Also to adopt rules pertaining to the board operations, powers, and duties. So this would be how you run your meetings, what type of committees you have, and that kind of thing. More statutory powers and duties. You can accept gifts from your community, grants. You can offer and pay rewards if if somebody commits a crime on any of your property. Then you must also give prior approval to all education programs carried out by private organizations and agencies. So if you're operating any programs that are operated by private or nonprofit organizations, those must be approved by the board. Now, these are regulatory requirements. These are put together by usually the Department of Education, the Public Education Department, and they're very consistent with the statutory requirements. And this says that you will exercise all powers and duties that are in the public school and law. So all of the statutory responsibilities are covered here on number 1. Then in addition to that, you have the authority to approve and support the district's education plan for success, employ and evaluate the local superintendent annually, ensure that each board member participates in a planned program of training. New Mexico is one of a few states that has mandatory training requirements for board members, as you know. It's clear in the regulations that you must delegate all administrative and supervisory functions to the superintendent, and you must refrain from involvement in delegated administrative functions. As you know, we get quite a few complaints about board members across the state getting involved in day-to-day activities, and this is not allowed through the regulations. Review, revise, and amend and submit policies to PED on an annual basis. And one of the great responsibilities you have is to award diplomas to students who have completed graduation requirements. I was a board member for 3 terms, and that was one of my favorite things to do, and that was graduation day, hand out those diplomas and hope that we provided a good education to those students. Some more regulatory requirements: ensure that the district curriculum is aligned with state standards, ensure that district funds are appropriated and managed and dispersed correctly, being responsible for the oversight of district revenue and expenditures. So again, these all relate to the budget, making sure your budget is sound and that your expenditures are in accordance with your budget. Also, accept responsibility for ensuring the success of each school in your district. And, these are all important regulations and statutory requirements. There's really not a shortcut. You just need to continue to ask in your community if they feel you're doing, if you're on the right track in what you're doing. And we will try and provide that information to you as well through the various courses and training that we provide. So the National School Board Association has what they call the key work of school boards, and they've broken it up a little different into major categories. The first of setting the vision for education in your community. Second is establishing the structure and environment in your district to make sure that you can implement your vision. And the commitment that it takes from you to become an effective school board member, keeping up on all the reading requirements, knowing what the issues are, reading your book, your meeting packets, and just being prepared to make decisions in these areas. Also, being an advocate for public schools and students, it's important that we take time and that you take time in your district to let the community know all the good things that are happening in your public schools. There's good things happening every day in your schools, and your students are doing an outstanding job. So try and make sure that you take time in your meetings to recognize these achievements. Also, being accountable, establishing standards and goals in your district so that you can go back and look to make sure that you're making progress in these areas. Also, working as a team. It's so difficult. It's difficult enough to meet all of the responsibilities that you have working as a team, and much less if you're not working as a team. So please make a special effort to do that. And of course, devoting the time necessary for meetings and communications. And as I mentioned earlier, taking advantage of the opportunities for training and development. So some of the requirements you have is not to miss any meetings. And this guy's in the lineup here because he's missed 3 board meetings. In New Mexico, you can miss 4 consecutive regular meetings. And if you do that, the board can declare your seat vacant. If you miss 6 meetings, it's an automatic vacancy. So please make every effort to attend your meetings. Then we'll get into the school board code of ethics. Many of you have seen this. We administered this to all of the newly elected members back in 2021, and we do this after every election. And it's to attend all scheduled meetings, avoid speaking on behalf of the board except when authorized, respect the confidentiality of privileged information that you will receive in executive session regarding lawsuits, personnel issues, and student issues. So please keep that confidential. Recognize that you have no legal authority outside of a board meeting. Recognize that all decisions of the board have to be made in a public meeting. And upgrade your performance by keeping current on issues. Work in harmony and always promote and protect the integrity of the board. Let the community know that you're working together for the betterment of the district and the students. And support the employment of the best qualified school staff. If you don't do that, you're shortchanging your own students. So always try and get the best staff that you can for your district. Make every effort to see that the district employees are paid properly, dealt with fairly. Avoid being placed in a position of conflict of interest, and refrain from using your board position for personal or partisan gain. And accept that your primary function is to ensure that schools are run properly by the superintendent and staff and not to be run by you, okay? You need to keep that in mind. Welcome and encourage active citizen participation to better understand the needs of the community and strive to protect and perpetuate our democratic way of life. And finally, remember that your first and greatest concern must be the fair and equal educational opportunities for all students. So that consists of the state school board code of ethics. And here's another little cartoon here, indicating that you should take a team approach. So as an individual board member, you might, when you're out in the community, when you're outside of the meeting, you don't have any authority at that time. You only have authority when you're sitting with the rest of the board, for instance, at your meeting tonight. When you're alone, you're just another citizen with no authority. And trying to exert individual power can get you in legal trouble without protection. You're encouraged to listen to concerns and complaints from the district parents and constituents, but you want to make sure that you listen to them, but always encourage them to follow the chain of command and the established complaint handling process. Express appreciation for them to letting you know that, but getting involved in those areas is not your responsibility, and it may get you in trouble if that issue turns out to be the result to end up in a grievance. So saying I'll take care of it is not appropriate, and that indicates to individuals in the community that you're willing to fight their battle. So listen, but ask them to take the chain of command up the ladder. Agreeing with the complainer may put you in an embarrassing position when the issue comes to the board, and you may have to excuse yourself if you've already heard one side of the story. You'll be getting calls like this. Many of you already have probably asking if you to check with the superintendent if you can find Joey's books or any other issue, but I'm sure you're getting some late night calls from time to time. Again, please encourage those people to follow the chain of command. And some final bits of advice in this section. If you have any questions, any of you can call us at Nmsba, and we'll be happy to provide you with any advice in terms of your legal responsibilities, your statutory responsibilities, or any best practices that we are aware of. It will take commitment, preparation, and knowledge for you to succeed. And remember, we're here to help you, and we're counting on you. So this section concludes the sort of the overall orientation for our board members. We try and do this right after every election, and as I mentioned earlier, your success deals on asking the right questions. So I'm hoping you might have some questions for me in terms of any things that you'd like more clarification on your responsibilities, or anything that you run into at this time, particularly the 3 new board members. We're here again as a resource for you, and we also provide additional information and resources for board presidents and board officers. So any questions at this time?
Yeah, Mr. Guillen, Dave Terrazas here. You talked about mandatory training. What is the requirement hourly for the board members for the year?
Yeah, for the year, it's really not a lot. It's only 5 hours of training in one year. And the training year goes from September 1st to August 31st of each year. So we're in the process now of finalizing the training hours for each one of our members. We're required to track the training for each of the members and report that to the Public Education Department. Many of our board members receive up to 40 and 50 hours of training every year, and we also recognize those board members at the annual conference. Trying to see if I can get out of this. There. And so the penalty for not achieving the 5 hours is that your name appears on the school district report card that's issued by the Public Education Department with those members that have met the requirement and those that have not met the requirement. So there's no other penalty other than that. But again, we encourage you to take as much training as you can. At any one of our conferences, you're able to, of the 4 conferences that we do a year, you're able to gain about, anywhere from 10 to 12 to 15 hours at any one of our conferences. We also allow 2 hours at each of the region meetings in the fall and in the spring. And we're coming up on the fall region meetings pretty soon here in September and October. But again, we're required by the Department of Education to track for every one of the school board members in New Mexico.
I have a question. I'm not sure if this was answered. The 5 hours that are required for training, must they be conducted through the New Mexico School Board Association, or can they be acquired elsewhere?
You can acquire them elsewhere if but you need to run them by us beforehand for approval. We need to make sure that we have a formal agenda and the presenter, and then we can approve those.
So they have to still be approved by the School Board Association, not through the PED.
Right.
In addition, school board members can become master school board members and conduct training in the local districts. Does that count towards those 5 hours?
Actually, by that time, the master board member has already achieved most of the training requirements. There are 3 levels of training. I think once you get to 20 hours, one to 30 hours, and another one to 40 hours, those master board members have already gotten 40 hours, and then they are allowed to train. So if those master board members need their own training at that time, we could possibly give them the 5 hours based on them doing training rather than being trained. But most of the master board members don't have a problem meeting that 5 hours.
No, I wasn't asking for the master board members. I apologize for not being clear. I was asking for those in attendance of those classes under the master school board member.
Yes, and we would again sanction those with the master board member, making sure what the topic was and what the presentation was going to be on and when it was going to be. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any more questions if you want to proceed to the next topic.
Okay, let's see if we can get that one up a little smoother this time.
And I get, Lisa, do you have the hard copies of the presentation?
I don't, but I can pick them up tomorrow.
Okay, Mr. Guillen, as you go on to the next presentation, could you advance the slides so that they can show up on the screen?
I was advancing them, wasn't it showing?
No, it stayed on the same one throughout.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. I sent those for copying earlier today, so that you would have them.
Yes, and for for us here at the meeting, it's perfectly fine. But Ms. Dean did not receive them, and she's not here, but she is online. So if as you put up your screen, if you could advance the slides, that would be beneficial to her.
Well, I am advancing them. I advanced them. I was reading from them as I advanced them.
You might have to click on them. They're there. They show up on the right-hand margin.
Oh. See, on mine, it just blanked out the whole screen. I was hoping to get through this afternoon, but as a test run.
I'm taking notes as he's talking through it.
Okay.
And so like when I can pick up the package tomorrow. And so I don't think it's, cause I know but I can see it. It just looks like it's a bulleted list for each, slide.
Right.
So there's not a lot of info, I mean, like detailed info. So like, I think I'm okay. As long as I, can get a copy of the slides. I think I'll be good, but I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are you able to see the other slides or just the first slide?
Just the
Well,
first slide.
you can see the first slide, but the other slides are right next to it, like little bullets right next to it, or little like pics next to it.
Oh, shucks. Let me try the entire screen this time and see if by chance it
Try start slideshow or begin slideshow or something like that. That might help.
yeah, and I did, but let me try it again and see if it's any better. Can you see it now?
No, sir.
Okay. Okay. Let me go back. And
It's coming up now. Okay, Daniel, can you? I think Daniel's on. Yeah.
so can you see that slide?
Yes, Daniel is making it full screen. Hold on a second.
Okay, and I'm going to go to the second slide just to see if you're able.
Maybe you should put it in presentation mode.
Is it on presentation mode?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's time for I have a new.
A new presentation? Yeah.
No. I went to the. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I went to the wrong one. Let me get. Let me do something. Let me start it before I share and see if that helps. Nope.
First grade. We'll see.
You see it now?
Yes, yes, we do.
Okay, I'm gonna switch from the first slide to the second slide.
Okay.
Is that,
No, evidently you're not on presentation. Well, can you tab down or click on the number 2
let's see.
or arrow down actually?
Yeah, I'm arrowing now
No, it's not
from
moving.
one all the way down to 3 real quick and then back.
No, it's not moving at all. It's staying on the 1.
Um,
Would you like to do that, Mr. Guillen? Or
Yeah. Yeah, I can do that real quick. I sent it to Irma, so let me, is she there? I'll just forward that to you.
Can you do it from your
he's,
phone?
he's showing me, like
Forward it to.
he just sent something.
Okay, and I'm sending it to who?
It was
So it's
Daniel Jaramillo.
Daniel Jaramillo. Okay.
Daniel, Dr. Spaletta has forwarded it to you.
I sent them in PDF mode, so
It should be on PDF, should be on. Oh, see if it works too. If it shows up in PDF, it could be just pages, and then you can advance the pages. Thank you.
Even though I was doing it earlier.
I'm sorry about that. But anyway, we'll get it done.
We can go ahead and start, and then you can catch up. Will that work for you, Daniel? There you go.
Very close.
It doesn't. Yes, now we can.
Yes, and I can see it too.
Yep.
Okay. This first or this presentation is based on, the relationship that should exist between the board and the superintendent. And you can advance it at this point. And we always say that united we stand, divided we fall. In fact, we have a program that we enlist with the Superintendents Association, where we try and make sure that we work together whenever there's problems with superintendents and boards and their relationship. We'll go in and provide some advice and counseling and that kind of thing if need be, and if they were wanting to fix their relationship. But again, it's very important. We've always relied on the wisdom of the voters to select board members and the expertise of trained professionals as superintendents. We can go to the next slide. So the board and the superintendent alone each has strengths and each has weaknesses, but together, when they're working together, they'll support each other's weaknesses and strengths. On the next slide. And I'll go through these real quickly. So if we can go to the board's strengths is that they're elected by the community and they're from the community. So these are your strengths. You also you come from different experiences, different walks of life. There's businessmen, there's former educators, there's government workers, and so on. And you all have different ways of looking at things. So you have different perspectives, and you represent a variety of views around the community. On the next slide, the weaknesses of the board are that you are basically part-time members. You don't dedicate your full, day and week to this. And members are generally not trained in education, but as what we've heard a little earlier, you do have some educators on your board, which should benefit your perspective quite a bit. And the other weakness of the board is that the district can't be run by 5 different people. So you can't have that many cooks in the kitchen, as they say. So on the next slide, the superintendent's strengths are that the superintendent has professional training in education and experience in education. And the superintendent has the ability to develop action plans to pursue the goals of the board. And he has the executive authority that you all have granted him by hiring him as your superintendent. And again, his is a full-time commitment. Many of our superintendents work many hours. So again, those are the strengths. Then on the next slide, the weaknesses of the superintendent are that person is not elected. He or she are often from outside the community and not aware of the community as the board members are. And it's only one person, one set of experiences. So again, the different views that the board brings together helps round that out. So on the next slide is the complementary roles. The strengths of one complement the weakness of the other. The board brings the diverse rules, views, and experiences and interests, and the representations from the community to help set the district goals and priorities. And then the superintendent uses his expertise and ability to translate those goals into concrete work plans that you all can monitor and ensure that our goals are being followed. So to discuss the division of responsibility a little bit more on that next slide is the board representatives board is representative of the community, developing overall direction and policy for the district. In other words, what is to be done, what you want done, what are your goals, your objectives. And the superintendent uses his professional education experience to help achieve those goals, to determine how it's going to be done, he's going to implement your goals. And the division of responsibility on this little time or clock here, the board operates from the top half of the clock, adopting the goals, adopting the policies. Then it goes over to the superintendent to develop the plans, to implement the plans, to monitor progress. And then it's up to you as well to monitor progress and evaluate the results and make any adjustments that you feel are necessary to the goals and the policies. So some of the prerequisites for a good positive relationship, there are 4 items, and I'll go into each one of these in more detail. But each other to respect the role of the other. So and their limited roles, so that you understand what you can do and what you can't do, and the superintendent understands what is his responsibility and not. The communication is the most important, I think, and we'll get into that, but communicating between the board and between the superintendent. Then there's some areas of mutual support and cooperation, and then also of vital importance is the trust that all of you bring to the table, trusting each other to do the right things and to do those things that are within your responsibility or assignment. So having respect for the limited roles, as I mentioned, the superintendent must pursue the board's agenda and priorities. There's no question about that. You all need to set that, of course, with advice from the superintendent, but you have the authority and the responsibility to adopt those. And then the board must support the superintendent's freedom to choose the ways and means to pursue those priorities and that agenda. It's like, giving him a destination. You're driving to Albuquerque, and you're entrusting him to take the right route. And once he gets in there and he's with you, you have to support him in the road he chooses to get you there by. Very important, again, communication. The superintendent must keep the board members reasonably apprised of important developments in the district, and the board must freely share information that they get in the community with the superintendent. I received a call yesterday from a board member that is saying that the superintendent is not informing the board of some major activities that are going on in the district, and that can't happen. It needs to be a free-flowing information, not on detail, but on major items. The next slide. In terms of the communication responsibilities of the superintendent, to provide comprehensive board meeting packets prior to each of your meetings, making sure that you have enough information to make the decisions that you're going to be asked to make and to vote on. And then having timely responses to board members' reasonable requests for information. So you can request information from the superintendent, either as a board or individually, but those requests must be reasonable and allow the superintendent time to fulfill those requests for information. If there's news between meetings, that can be shared via email or websites or newsletters or even the telephone. And the superintendent should find out what kind of information, especially now with a new board that you have there, what each of you can agree on the type of information that you want him to provide to you on a regular basis. And then on the board side of the communication, board members should promptly convey information to support the superintendent's ability to anticipate and address matters. For instance, many of you may hear something from parents or out in the community that is going on, or maybe even from students. There's going to be a walkout tomorrow. You need to share that information with the superintendent so that he can be prepared. And board members should not use the information they get out in the community in terms of complaints, problems, to criticize or intimidate the superintendent. More information for the superintendent to use to address those issues. And so communication with employees is the responsibility of the superintendent. Remember The employees work for the superintendent, they don't work for the board. So you need to be careful about getting information from employees and the relationship that you have with employees. Open Meetings Act, we need to realize that you all are subject to open meetings requirements. The board may only act, as we mentioned earlier, in an open meeting following notice of the board meeting and making sure that those items are on the agenda. The superintendent may provide information to board members, again, by phone, email, etc. But the superintendent cannot pull members on items outside of a regular meeting. Board members may ask that an issue be placed on the agenda for a meeting, but again, those issues must be discussed by all of the board in an open meeting. Every board member, again, must support the superintendent's efforts to succeed. You want your superintendent to succeed, and the superintendent must advance the board's agenda for successful conclusions on your goals and objectives. So all of you need to be making sure that you are helping each other succeed. And then every board member must support the superintendent's efforts by speaking to the superintendent with one voice regarding the district's direction and policies. The majority on any issue is the voice of the board. Because the superintendent, again, can't pursue 5 different agendas. So directives to the superintendent must be by a majority vote of the board and not by individual members. So, for instance, at a meeting, if one of you asks that the superintendent consider something or provide something, it should be up to the board president at that time to say, do all of you agree with that? Just to make sure that there's consensus that is something that is needed, and to give the superintendent information that yes, the entire board needs it. If the other board members say, well, we don't need that necessarily every meeting, or we need this or that, but at least you have a little discussion and the superintendent knows whether the majority of the board feels that way about the particular information or issue. And again, board members have no authority as individuals. The next item here, support of board decision. Disagreement on boards is common and it's acceptable, but members in the minority on the issue have a duty to support the majority's decision. It's inappropriate to undermine the majority decision behind the scenes. There's some hot issues I know that all of you deal with, but again, know that once the vote is taken, that you move on to the next item and try and not linger on that or have hard feelings about it. By the same token, the majority of the board doesn't have should not act oppressively. School boards work through compromise and consensus, and if the board develops permanently opposing voting blocks, then something is wrong. If the same 3 and it's a 3-2 all the way down, the same people all the time, that's not a good thing. You should be all looking at issues rather than voting blocks and trying to make sure that you consider the issue and not who's proposing that. And then finally, trust. The trust must exist among board members and between the board and the superintendent. And you know, now that you're getting to know each other, assume that everybody's trustworthy and build on it, and try and make sure that it happens. And board members and the superintendent should assume that all are working in good faith, absent evidence to the contrary. Don't ascribe ill will or ill motivations. Don't hold grudges. Mediate and reserve problems. And listen, always, if you're having a problem with a superintendent or with another board member, go out for a cup of coffee and talk about it and see if you can resolve those issues before they become bigger than they really are. For the most part, you'll agree on many items, and you'll be you'll have different opinions, but it should never get personal. And then what can destroy the trust in the superintendent? We've seen this from time to time across the state, the inability to communicate or lack of communication. This is very important. Everybody needs to know what's going on, major items, shouldn't have a hidden agenda. Superintendent shouldn't be making policy decisions without consultation. Shouldn't be answering questions evasively or providing misinformation. So those are things that can destroy the trust in the superintendent. And it's like a marriage. Many of you know that, as long as there's communication and trust, everybody's working good and you're moving forward. So the role of the board and the superintendent in this is to establish, the board and superintendent establish goals and priorities together, annually and long term. The board contributes the community needs, board members' perceptions, and the superintendent again uses his professional assessment of the needs, what is most important, and puts a plan of action together with a sequence of events and deadlines. Many board members are accused of micromanagement, and I'm going to give you a little tip here on trying to avoid micromanagement. Again, you don't want to get involved into the day-to-day things. You want to stay at the policy level, at the budget level, and so the board needs to be trustworthy. No interference, no hidden agendas, no fair weather friendships. And you're okay with a superintendent unless if you're getting everything you need or want. The willingness to recognize achievement, and also the constructive criticism only. So, and then the superintendent must be trustworthy, deal with members equally, provide ample communication, protect the board from surprises or embarrassments. Again, you don't want to find out about emergencies that are happening from the news media or from parents. You want to know that something's happening in the school. You want to know that from the superintendent as soon as possible. And also accept the responsibilities for failures. The superintendent should, and also accept constructive criticism. And then the test, in general, if the board's concern is with the presence or effectiveness of a policy or a system, it's usually legitimate concern and oversight activity. But in general, again, if the board's concern is with the performance of an individual staff member or staff members, it's probably likely to be micromanagement. You want to get involved, again, in the higher level issues, not in the personnel issues, and let the superintendent deal with those. The president and there's a little bit closer of a relationship or different relationship between the board president and the superintendent. Sometimes boards feel like the president gets more attention, but again, there's a little more responsibility there. You all have selected a board president to help you run your meetings and be your spokesperson. So the president and the superintendent will communicate more frequently to discuss items to be placed on the agenda, in what order they'll be placed on, and what kind of action is required by the board. Also, the role, you should get together on the role the superintendent will play at the board meetings and when recommendations will be presented. So again, the order of items, how the recommendations will be presented by the superintendent, and the type of reports that the superintendent will provide at board meetings. Also, how the superintendent intends to use staff or consultants during a meeting, how to handle emergency situations that might arise. Again, dealing with the superintendent, with the president on a closer basis, how to deal with special interest groups, and also dealing with the news media. Who's going to be the spokesperson? Is it going to be the superintendent or the board president on issues? So all those things need to be discussed between the board president and the superintendent. And again, for the benefit of the entire board. Some critical activities for a successful team, and I think we're getting pretty close to the end here. Make sure that the board has a clearly defined and active role in the district's planning process. Again, setting up your goals and objectives. The board and the superintendent have full discussions of how the board performs its oversight of the superintendent, how you're going to develop your superintendent evaluation, and those kinds of things. The board and superintendent have periodic discussions about the adequacy of communication vehicles. If you go down the line after a few months here and you feel that the communication isn't working, you need to sit down and discuss that and make sure that you adjust it accordingly so that everybody feels that they're receiving the information that they need. And then the board has a clearly defined procedure for governing their actions as individual board members. Some of these are called board norms, the things that can be expected of board members during the meetings and outside of meetings as well. And your team can be successful if you focus your attention on student achievement, on student learning, by allocating your resources to establish needs. If you've established a priority, but you don't have anything in the budget for it, you're not likely going to be able to address those needs. So make sure you budget sufficiently to address your needs. By utilizing the data to make informed decisions, you want to know why the recommendation is this or that and what kind of data you have, and ask for data all the time. It makes your job easier. By engaging the community you serve, you always want to try and let the community know that you're there for them to provide input, provide information, and utilize that information to make your decisions. And then finally, by providing a quality education for all of your students, you can be successful. So I think that concludes this presentation. Just an overview so that you understand the roles and how you can stay within your lane in being successful. So questions?
Lisa, do you have any questions?
You know what? I don't, not at the moment. Thank you.
We don't have any questions. So thank you very much for your presentation. I look forward to attending the training sessions there with you in person. We appreciate your help in putting together this young board in a consistent direction.
Okay, and thank you. And we have some of you received these books that I don't know if you can see them, but they're the Becoming a Better Board Member book.
Yes, and that's a good book.
Do I need to send just 3, or
I think we need 4. Or you have one? Okay, 3.
Okay, if the other 2 have them that were there previously, we'll go ahead and send these. And this is a good reference document for all of the new board members. It has information on every responsibility you have, so it'll give you some advice from the national level.
Thank you very much. That'd be very helpful.
Okay.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, and good luck to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lisa, stay on. We have Mrs. Gallegos that's going to, Ms. Gallegos, sorry, but to present on the Open Meetings Act.
And Mr. President, if I may, my name is Elena Gallegos. Nice to be here before all of you. If we could maybe take just about a 5-minute break so that I can set up my computer with the PowerPoint.
Absolutely.
Is that acceptable?
Absolutely.
Okay, I've got it queued up, but you know how technology is. I'm worried that in the transfer, if they don't transfer speed, he said maybe about 5 minutes and Dr. Split if I can get your assistance.
Sure.
Okay.
We shall adjourn for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, it is 6:34 and we are all in attendance and we're reconvened. Ms. Gallegos.
Okay, President Guadiana, members of the board, Superintendent Spalletta. Again, my name is Elena Gallegos, and it's an honor to be here in front of you. I know you just finished what looked like an excellent presentation by Mr. Guillen, but I also know that when you're not in person, there's a tendency not to have interaction. And so I'm hoping that because I'm in person and Board Member Dean, I look forward to meeting you in person at some point, but I'm hoping we can get maybe a little bit more interaction. I realize that there may be a few things that I mentioned that may overlap a little bit with Mr. Guillen, but I hope that this is an open meeting, and so there's not a problem with you asking specific questions. Of course, I don't want to, we won't relive the past, but asking specific questions about how we might do things in the future, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have about the practical aspects of this, because what you know that I don't know is practically what this looks like in Cobre. So I can make some assumptions, but you know better than I how it's practically working. And Dr. Spalletta, I hope as well on your end, from the administrative perspective of setting these things up, that you also feel free to ask me questions as well. So shall I proceed?
Yes.
Okay, so specifically what I've done here is set up some tips on Open Meetings Act and then the authority. One of the things, I do a lot of presenting, and one of the things I always say is I never want you walking away quoting me. What I want you to do is be able to quote the law or quote the authority. And while it might be flattering that you're quoting me, it's not really worth much more than flattery. So the first tip is do not take action on an item that the public could not reasonably anticipate would be acted upon based on the wording of the board agenda. So what you want to think about from the public's perspective is, had they known that you were going to be talking about this, they want to be able to, you want the specificity requirement legally under Open Meetings Act of your agenda is to give enough specificity so that a member of the community, a member of the public can look at it and decide based on that agenda whether it's an important item for them and therefore whether they'll attend either virtually or in person. And so this is an actual example from New Mexico Attorney General opinion, where the board voted to discharge the superintendent and appoint an interim superintendent following an executive session that was noticed for the purpose of evaluating the superintendent. Now, I'm sure as board members, everyone can imagine that out of an evaluation, hopefully it's out of many evaluations, but out of an evaluation, it could culminate in the impression on the part of the board that something more serious needed to occur, like placing the board member on leave, conducting an investigation, appointing an interim, but all that was noticed on this was the evaluation of the superintendent. And so what did the Attorney General determine? That did not meet the specificity requirements. And so here's the exact language in the Open Meetings Act about listing the specific items of business. And then here's some guidance from the New Mexico Attorney General Compliance Guide. I'm hoping that among your resources, one of the things that you download, you can pull it just from a Google search using these authorities, and I'll make sure that Dr. Spalletta has a copy of the PowerPoint after this so that he can recirculate it to you all. But these compliance guides are available online. I can tell you that every day, including today, I pull it up, I search them, I look at them. Much of my advice comes out of them, and so I recommend them to you. One of them is the Attorney General Compliance Guide on the Open Meetings Act, which is the subject today. But I will also tell you that they have the same compliance guide for IPRA, the Inspection of Public Records Act, and the Governmental Conduct Act, all of which the district and you all are under. So you can see here in the compliance guide, and I won't read it to you, but the emphasis on not using vague terms and being specific in order to give the public that reasonable notice. One of the things I'll also say, I don't know if I didn't include it, but is that when you look at the case law on specificity, what you see, and is the rule of thumb that I use with clients, is the more important the item is going to be to the public, the more specific you need to be. So obviously, whether a superintendent's contract is being renewed, whether the superintendent's contract is being up for consideration for possible ending of it. And the reason I'm using that example is not because I expect that to happen, but because that was the example in the Attorney General opinion. It was placing the superintendent on leave, and that's going to be something that's going to matter to the public. And so the higher the public interest item, the more very specific that you need to be. So next tip, do not make a motion to amend the agenda to add an action item. This is one of the things that I think is confusing to new board members, because you all know that like the first or second or third item on your agenda is an action item to approve the agenda. And sometimes people think that that means that they can add new items that weren't noticed 72 hours in advance. So let me just briefly walk you through. This is a hypothetical. A local newspaper publishes an investigative journalism article that reveals excessive spending on out-of-state conferences, poor attendance at conference sessions, and too much partying on the part of administrators while at these conferences. Again, pure hypothetical. At the next board meeting, during the approval of the agenda, one board member makes a motion to add an item to the agenda to eliminate out-of-state travel from the budget. And you can see how that would happen. All of a sudden, there's been public attention because of an article. Board wants to act like they're being responsive, and so it makes sense that at the point of the approval of the agenda, it might seem logical to add that, but you can't at that point. So, except in the case of an emergency, at least 72 hours prior to the meeting, the agenda has to be available to the public on the public body's website and in whatever other forms that in your annual resolution you've listed. But at a minimum, if the district has a website, which you all do, it has to be posted on the website. And it's 72 hours, regardless of whether there are weekends and holidays in that.
Christine has a question.
Yes.
What is specifically considered an emergency?
So very good question. And I think there it is. I have it on the next slide. So as the compliance guide points out, the Act does relax the agenda requirements in cases of an emergency. And in brackets there, I pulled out of the statute emergency. So it has to be unforeseen circumstances that, if not addressed immediately by the public body, in this case the board, will likely result in injury or damage to persons or property or substantial financial loss to the public body. Now, I will tell you that the unforeseen circumstances is something that the Attorney General emphasizes in Attorney General opinions. So if it only became an emergency because we failed to plan appropriately and it wasn't an unforeseen situation, then it wouldn't fall under the emergency exception. I can tell you that I've been practicing school law now for 34 years. I hope all of you are thinking I look too young for that, but it has been 34 years, going on 35. And I can count, I think on one hand, maybe two, the number of times that I've seen a true emergency that meets that exception. It's very, very, very rare. So most of the time, you can certainly call special board meetings, but those would be at least the 72-hour requirement, which is consistent also. I have looked at your OMA resolution, and I believe it does say 72 hours to call a special board meeting. You couldn't make it for less than that. You could make it for more than that.
You mentioned OMA resolution. Is that the same thing as the annual?
The annual resolution.
So is that something that we need to vote on annually? Or?
Annually, you have to vote on it.
We've done it this year.
Oh, yeah.
We did, is it calendar year or is it?
Most districts do it fiscal year. Most districts do it fiscal year. So you're probably doing it June, July. A lot of my districts were doing it, yeah, June-ish.
Is there a requirement on the media that we need to post? Or?
It does need to be available to the public, because one of the things about the OMA resolution is that
If it includes when you have your regular meetings, like, first Tuesday of the month, or if it includes a list of the dates of the planned meetings, then you don't have to meet. That constitutes that advance notice. It doesn't take care of the agenda, but it takes care of the legal notice. And so then I believe your annual resolution, if it's like most, says 10 days for a regular meeting, but you don't have to do it again because you've done it. That's one of the purposes that annual resolution serves for your regular
So we could
meetings.
have just a list of all of our meetings for the year and just, that would be our legal notice?
That would be your legal notice most districts do then another one as a confirmation that they're holding it. But if you look at the Attorney General's guidance on what constitutes reasonable notice for a regular meeting, it's 10 days. 10 days is a long time, but most districts aren't having to worry about the 10 days because their resolution already specifies either by date or by, first Tuesday of the month as an example. And so as long as you're sticking to that, then you've done the annual notice, which the resolution also spells out.
Okay.
So you want to make sure then, the other thing the resolution spells out is what constitutes notice. And so if your OMA resolution is going to be part of that notice, then you want to make sure that, how it's posted, all of that meets those requirements. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And I can always follow up with you all if there's specific questions.
So in the case that there's a meeting that's not pre-identified in the resolution, I don't understand the 10-day requirement you just mentioned.
So if it's a regular meeting, and sometimes I think it gets really confusing what is a special meeting and what's a regular meeting. But if there's certain things, maybe finance things and things that you do in a regular meeting, and maybe for some reason you have to cancel the regular meeting, and so you're going to do the regular meeting on a different day because the major business work typically happens in a regular meeting. Because it's off schedule, you have to meet the notice requirements of your resolution for a regular meeting. And what the Attorney General has said, and in the sample that they give at the end of the guide, they use that rule of thumb, now the resolution is what decides it. The rule of thumb for what's reasonable notice for a regular meeting is 10 days. So if you're canceling a regular meeting and then trying to reschedule it, you're going to have probably, and again, I don't have your resolution in front of me, but probably a longer notice requirement than a special meeting. Special meetings where you're just taking care of not the full-blown business, but maybe something off schedule, or maybe some districts have what they call work sessions. But if it's an off-schedule meeting, a special meeting, most districts say in their notice that the reasonable notice of the special meeting is the 72 hours. So then it aligns with the agenda, and you're posting notice and agenda at the same time.
And so if we have regular meetings that are listed on our resolution, all we really have to go forward when they occur is the posting of the agenda within 72 hours of the meeting.
Yes.
Okay. And that serves as a reminder as well of the meeting.
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm not trying to discourage you from not posting an additional notice early, but those can be constructed and go up automatically. But the point of that resolution is to provide that notice. And if you're doing it annually, you're giving 12 months, 11 months, 10 months notice.
And if we start, for instance, now we do the 72-hour notice for both the agenda and the meeting. If we were to start with a resolution, we could break away from that without any further public notice.
Well, you always, if your public notice, again, we have to go back to the resolution, but it may have you, for example, send it out to the newspaper. It may have you do certain things. You would have to make sure that if you're using the resolution as that notice, that it satisfies that. But usually embedded in that notice, it says that the 10 days for a regular meeting is if it's not already included in that resolution.
We have sometimes a hard time meeting the 3-day notice via the newspaper because they close so many days.
Yes, yeah, you're right. That would meet that. But you've got also the agenda obligations.
We can print that and post that,
Yeah.
you know, at our
And you're gonna
will.
wanna look at what your commitments are to the newspaper for the agenda too, because you'll have to meet those commitments. And if for some reason you're concerned that those commitments may be more than what the law requires, I mean, sometimes, you know, you have to follow your resolution. But I do have some districts who commit more in that resolution than they really have to, and they complicate it because now they've, you know, raised the bar for themselves and they're trying to meet a commitment that maybe they don't have to. So you might want to go back and look at what the resolution says as far as the media, and if it is onerous because of the challenge of getting communications to the media, we can look at whether or not that can be adjusted under the legal standard. But the 72 hours is really, it's because of the agenda requirement. You've always got to pre-plan in advance of 72 hours. It's the 10 days that I think mess districts up, and it typically comes either because they think that 10 days applies even when it's in the resolution, or because they were trying to schedule a meeting that had to get canceled.
And since the Attorney General lists that as kind of a guide, can we've been routine, and our resolution calls for a 72-hour notice in the paper before a meeting as opposed to the 10. And we've
For
been
regular
doing,
meetings,
yes, for regular meetings.
and not the agenda, but the meeting itself.
Correct.
Just because the Attorney General has said it multiple times, I think it's safer to follow that 10-day rule of thumb for regular meetings. But again, if you've, as far as notice, if you've given that resolution to the newspaper and they already know, and then you're just posting it, reposting it again for that specific meeting, 72 hours, that's really a reminder notice is all it is.
Okay.
Because they've had that resolution that includes that date. So it sounds like we've been trying to kind of do both, and what's making it challenging is trying to do both.
Well, the
we
newspaper
haven't
changed their days that they're open, so that's made it challenging.
And we haven't been doing both. We haven't been posting that on our resolutions. Our resolutions do not include any specific dates other than the first and the second and the fourth
Yeah,
Monday.
but if we're meeting in the second and the fourth, that's notice of those meetings.
Oh, okay.
So that's,
Yeah,
Okay, I thought it was just, okay.
yeah, so we really may be just fine.
So if the agenda is because of the newspaper closing, if it's posted on our website, does that cover
I would need to go back.
agenda requirement?
No, I think that I would need to go back and look at the sample. I know you have to do the reach out to the paper, but I don't know that it's the same, or to any media that's asked. And so we need to look at what the minimum requirements are for that. But I don't understand why, if you send it to them, it's not posted in the paper. It may be sending it to them to make them aware of it. Let's double check. At this point, I'm guessing, and I want to flip on my screen to the guide. And maybe what we can do is if there's a point in time where you all need to just stretch, I can pull the guide and we can answer that specific question.
And it is that we put it on our website and
At the schools.
Yes, and that definitely complies. Okay, so emergency meeting, what changes can you make to the agenda at the meeting? I mean, it's not an empty action item when you're voting on whether to amend the agenda. And so you could definitely delete items that you don't intend to discuss. And in fact, in the OMA complaint involving the New Mexico Gaming Control Board, the Attorney General recommended that you clean up an agenda. But if you have on the agenda items that you thought they were going to be ready, like minutes, approval of the minutes of the meeting. Well, if by the time you get there, those minutes aren't ready, then the cleanest thing is to pull them off the agenda. The other thing too, and I've actually looked at some minutes today in the context of some work I was doing. Sometimes you all will reorder an item on the agenda. So maybe you've got a special guest and you don't want the special guest to have to wait. You've got a lawyer in the room who's charging you to sit there. You may want to move that lawyer up, that sort of thing. So yes, those are the kinds of things when you're approving the agenda that you're really doing. I will tell you, some districts have a protocol for how soon the packet or certain categories of packet information needs to get to the board. And if it's dense, some board members will say, we didn't get our packet on time, and this is too much for us to go through, and we want these items pulled off because we didn't get the packet when we were expecting it, and we haven't had a chance to go through it and digest it. So those are the kinds of things that I regularly see that to me are normal and make sense.
So is it better to remove them rather than table?
That's a good question, Board Member Begay. I think that table, to me, it makes sense to table an action item. If you're really not even going to get to the discussion of it, you may just want to pull it off and then discuss it at a future meeting. When you're having a discussion but deciding not to take action, you might want to table the action, but the agenda item, and they say discussion and action on a budget adjustment request. And so you have the discussion about the budget adjustment request, but the board decides they would like more information. And so you might table the action on it. Okay. But honestly, either way, I think it's reasonably clear, and I wouldn't be concerned if you forgot to do something with that at the agenda stage, and then when you get into it, you realize, oh, we're really not ready to discuss it. Maybe you made a decision previous to that in the sequence of decision making that tells you now this one's premature and you didn't realize it. So honestly, I think either one is fine. There was one other thing though your question prompted in my brain, and that was consent agenda items. I don't know whether you use consent agenda very much.
No, we don't understand it that way yet.
Okay.
We talked about it recently. Yeah.
Okay. And so if you were, then that is something I always tell boards to pay attention to, is decide ahead of time at the agenda, at the point of approving the agenda, if you want to pull something off the consent agenda because you really would like discussion of it after all. And I can talk to you at any point in time about use of consent agenda. But if right now you're not using it, everyone's fine with that. That could be something that we explore another day. Okay. Do not speak for the board on an issue that has not been acted upon. I feel like I was, in the last few minutes of Mr. Guillen's presentation, and I feel like he hit some of that, but let me just go through a hypothetical example. And I tried to come up with on the hypotheticals examples that you could kind of see how easy it would be to fall into this kind of situation under these circumstances. So here's the hypothetical. During public forums, several parents and students complain that there's widespread bullying on campuses and ineffective discipline. So this would be the public comment. The board members proceed with discussing the issue, and one board member describes the restorative justice training she recently attended and the research support for its use in schools. Each board member speaks up and expresses his or her personal beliefs favoring restorative justice in the schools. Afterwards, a local journalist interviews the board president, who states that the board supports restorative justice practices and will be switching from zero tolerance to restorative justice. So there's this kind of like group building of consensus, but it wasn't even on the agenda. And so it was in response to a public comment, essentially a polling of the board. Nobody went around and said, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? But each board member starts speaking up, and then it leads to this conclusion that this is where we're going with discipline. So you need to be very careful on that.
So that's if it's outside of the board meeting. If it's inside the board meeting, then that's fine, except you don't get to the final conclusion that we're going to adopt this.
No. So, and this is important, and you may want to go back to the compliance guide. I've looked at this really carefully because I've had to argue it in lots of different contexts before the, including Attorney General complaints. If you look at the compliance guide and the OMA, it's not just, there are places in the compliance guide where the Attorney General will say, well, if there's no action taken on it, no harm, no foul, basically what you're saying. But there are other parts of not only OMA, but the guide itself that says that the public's entitled to observe your formulation to know and observe your formulation of a policy, which this is, whether it ends up in a policy manual, or it ends up as some sort of action item, or it translates into, you know, the final approval of your student handbook. It's formulation of policy. And so there may be members of the public that, had they known you were going to talk about this, they would have been there. And so my general rule of thumb in terms of a clean, crisp, disciplined board is that you don't respond to public comment, that you actually notice the public. And we've done scripts before for the board president. You may have a script you follow where you, before people make public comment, you kind of lay out the rules. And one of them is that unless it's an item on the agenda, the board isn't going to comment. Now, the things that you can do is that you can say, we need to look at putting that on a future agenda. So someone, let's take this example. You know, several parents complain about widespread bullying, and it takes discipline. And I've watched board members, I attend a lot of board meetings, learn that discipline, and the public gets used to it. When you're disciplined about it, the public will see that you're not treating it, it doesn't have to do with the subject matter. You're not treating anybody differently, but the public knows. In fact, now I'll go to some board meetings with my boards who have been doing this for a very long time, and people will get up in public comment and say, I know you can't comment, but they know that. Now, if they're speaking on an item on the agenda, and I'm getting a little off topic, but I think it may be helpful to you, I recommend too, again, not to confuse things, not to start engaging with that member of the public when they're speaking, but wait until it hits the agenda item, because there's First Amendment issues too. You have to treat everybody who gets up in public comment the same, regardless of the content, whether they're criticizing something or whether they're praising something. And so it really is best that public comment be kind of quarantined and have its boundaries, its place. It's really hard to start changing the rules of public comment when we don't like the comments we're getting. You open yourselves up to First Amendment challenges. And so it's really good to be very disciplined about how you approach public comment. You absolutely can comment, clarify, correct, discuss public comment subject matter if it's on the agenda, but I would wait till that point in the agenda.
And that's one area where I've probably been amiss, because it seems so condescending for somebody to come up and bring up something and the board's constant response, well, we'll take that under advisement.
It seems really rude, and that's why I agree with you. And so that's why I think, like I say, it takes discipline over time. I suggest you have a script. I don't think that you should be shy about the fact that you're reading that script, because that tells the public, and the script can educate them, and it's positive. I mean, I've got boards that I know their whole message is public involvement, public input, grassroots efforts. You can convey all of that and still have discipline around those things. And it's the consistency that leads people to understand that you're not doing this because you don't care about their voice. You're doing it for fairness. And so, and then, like I say, if it's already on the agenda and they're speaking to an agenda item, then part of the script can be that the board will discuss it during the agenda item.
And we have two open comment areas, and one is related to the agenda, and then the other one is just anything else.
Right. Yeah, and I know some boards have, I've not ever seen it actually work this way, but I think some boards allow people to check off when they fill out the public comment card if they want to wait and speak on it when it comes to the agenda. So maybe they don't want to, if they're speaking on an agenda item and maybe they don't want to do it during public comment, I think you can say if you want to speak on it when the agenda item comes up. Now you would want them to go first because you don't want, this isn't about, again, giving them a special privilege of interaction. It's still whatever number of minutes you allow for any other public comment, and it still shouldn't be an interaction, because you really will at some point get in trouble, because at some point you'll be treating one person's views differently than another person's. And it's that viewpoint discrimination that gets you into trouble when it comes to First Amendment.
So if someone chooses to comment during the actual agenda item, do they comment after a motion has been made and then there's discussion during that discussion time?
I think typically when I've seen that option in policy to be able to speak at the point of the agenda and on the form, but I've not actually really seen it regularly played out because usually it just all ends up in public comment. But I think if you wanted to do that, you could specify it even on the comment card. So again, you're not the one going, oh, that's Ms. Jones. We're gonna, kind of corral her into the most inconvenient spot possible because we know what she has to say. But somebody else gets more favorable treatment. And so I would first of all have it addressed in policy. And it might be, great since we're talking about this to go back and look at what your policies say about public comment and OMA. But address it in policy and then align your comment card and your procedures with that policy so that everyone is treated the same regardless of their viewpoint.
I also do something, and other board members do as well, but we speak out in the public input section as well as parents.
Yeah, I have seen some boards do that where, first of all, if a board member is not speaking in their role as a board member, which I think is a hard thing. I mean, I think that the truth is you're always going to be viewed as a board member. And so I would be careful with how you use that rather than make it commonplace that you're putting your hat on, taking it off, putting your hat on and taking it off. Because truly, especially when you've got the power of the dais, and then you're suddenly asking everybody to disregard that you're sitting behind the dais. I think that when you're a board member, obviously you're still going to parent-teacher conferences. Obviously you're still, attending events that your child is participating in. You want to be very careful that you're not sitting in a privileged spot or, gaining access in ways that other parents can't if you're there as a parent. But public comment, I would be careful with. I have told board presidents who say, I've got a board member that I think wants to speak in their individual capacity as a parent. What do? I definitely say, don't sit at the dais when you're, if you're going to come give public comment, you have to follow every single rule that a member of the public is following, including your position in the room during that time period. But again, without a specific example, and I don't want to go to a non-hypothetical, but I would really examine that and keep in mind that it's hard for anyone to view you as anything other than a board member. And so you want to always, and you were elected in part because of who you are in the community. So, I mean, a lot of you who are parents may very well have been elected by your constituents because you have the perspective of a parent. You don't need to be in the boardroom advocating for your individual child. And the votes that you take may bring with them the perspective you have as a parent. So I would really try to keep your individual role out of the boardroom period.
And most of the times the comments are something that we experienced as parents, like we attended this thing and it went really, really well. And it's an opportunity to tell the people that put that together, give them kudos and acknowledge.
Right. So I know a lot of districts that do board reports at the end of the agenda, and it's just board reports. Now, I have to caution them, don't start engaging in board reports in this dialogue because board reports is generic, right? The public doesn't know when you show up necessarily what you're going to say. So you don't want, you don't want a dialogue amongst each other because a report should be just that. But the report usually is kind of an activity report, and that would be a nice time to say, I attended this as a parent, but I want everybody to know that went really well, or, I was here at this event, and it's fine to say I was here because of this, but that's your platform to basically describe. And sometimes even the report may not even include necessarily something you attended that was district related. I attended a city council meeting and I saw how they did such and such, and I'm thinking it may be something the board might want to consider in the future. So out of that can sometimes come a list of ideas of what to put on the agenda in the future. But you live and breathe in this community. That's why you were elected. And so the board report is kind of an opportunity to, it can also be, I attended Nmsba conference last week, and this was the session I went to, and it made me think X, Y, Z.
Yeah,
And so
you put those on the agenda.
yeah, and that's good too. I like that when you all do, when boards do that. But I would think about it. Think about those examples of when y'all have used public comment for the board members, and if it would work under board report, I would consider it under board report.
Otherwise, get up and talk.
Yeah, and then then it doesn't kind of confuse what's going on here.
Yeah.
Who is this person? So that's my thoughts. Okay. So I really think Mr. Guillen covered this about speaking on behalf of the board. And I do think it's important that policy specify who can speak on behalf of the board. But certainly it should only be, and sometimes individual circumstances dictate that you might take specific action on who would be the spokesperson in that particular situation. That I didn't realize that right now you're in transition from Nmsba policies. So the quotes in there are from what comes up on Nmsba as your policies. So I went to that portal, but it is a chance for you to look at what Nmsba is attributed to you all as policy. But I found out today that you have that simple. Yeah. So I apologize. I don't have, yes.
On that.
Mhm.
It might be the same one you're thinking. So we have a local radio station, and they've invited all board members prior to participate on the radio station. And I've done it as a individual.
Mhm.
I know for me, I never said like, I'm speaking on behalf of the Cobre board. This is what we think. It was like my point of view, especially being a teacher. Is that okay?
I don't have any problem with that. I think, you know,
We still have First Amendment, right?
Right, you
We
still
can
have-
speak as individuals.
you can still speak as individuals. I do think, and I know Mr. Guillen brought this up, and again, some of these are fine lines and they're worth thinking about, because remember, ultimately, you're in service to a healthy district. And so you need to be aware of not using that as a platform to undermine decisions that have been made. So, you know, what your priorities are, what your initiatives are, what you're hoping to bring, you know, if it's, I mean, some board members are elected because of their union, you know, involvement. And so you've got, you know, the union wanting you to be a very pro-union board member because you used to be a teacher and you used to be a member of the union. And so those kinds of themes and initiatives and budget priorities and things that you're going to be a spokesperson for are absolutely fine. When a vote is taken, what you don't want to use is have the media be a platform for sour grapes. That's where I think the dividing line is. Now, I will tell you that there are some board members who, what they care about, you know, like I say, union is an example, maybe community schools is an example, what they care about, everybody knows, you know. And so it's not that you have to put away what you care about just because you ended up on the minority side of a vote. There are other ways later that you might continue to work toward those efforts. Maybe it's alternative energy sources, and you really wanted, you know, the district to purchase all electric buses and put solar panels, and you lost that vote this year. Well, it doesn't mean you're not going to continue to try and build pieces of that into the budget later. But what you don't want to do is take the sour grapes and be undermining the decision that got made. You might talk about, you know, how we might approach it differently in light of the vote that was taken.
You've had a different opinion of how we do that.
Okay, all right, well,
Appreciate yours.
yes. Oh, okay.
Lisa.
I have just a question that's kind of just talking about talking in public. Somebody approached me. She's has a large like social media outlet, and she asked me to kind of introduce myself, who I was. And so my question is like, if I do something like that, do I need to have it run by somebody? I mean, I'm very aware of what I say, you know, will be read by many people. I guess that's just my question. Is there something that I need to be aware of? Should I do it at all? I mean, and I'm not going to say I'm speaking for the board, but is there some protocol regarding something like that?
Well, and we can have some time of training just on social media, because there have been court cases, and so you do have to be careful on social media. One of the things is rolling quorum can develop through social media inadvertently. If you've got multiple board members active on social media, you can end up with a great big oops in terms of your positions, number one. Number two, there are First Amendment issues. If you are potentially creating some kind of a public forum, and then you start getting, you know, negative, you start cutting off, or maybe unfriending, or, you know, I don't have a lot of social media, but you in any way cut or remove maybe negative comments, you could potentially have a First Amendment claim. So there's a lot of legal nuance to social media. So I would be careful about social media. But again, in terms of my comments about these interviews, you're always campaigning, you know. So who you are and what you stand for and what's important to you as a board member, I see that as different from commenting on an upcoming agenda, basically trying to, you know, somehow undermine the board through your use of media, whether that be social media or whether that be traditional media. And so I think when I was responding to Vice President Murillo, I'm going to learn your names, but Vice President Murillo's question just a minute ago, what she was really describing is that, what do I stand for? You know, why did I run for the board? What do I stand for? What's important to me? And that's more to me that sort of ongoing campaign message, as opposed to a running commentary on how you'll vote, what you think of the votes, what you think of the members. That's a different thing. I hope I've cleaned up that distinction.
You did, and I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Sure.
If it is that we've passed a strategic plan, which we haven't yet, but hopefully we will, and we go out into the public forum and discuss that strategic plan, then we're still within our First Amendment and we're not bridging away, or
Well,
are we?
I think this is where it gets a little bit confusing in terms of the board ethics over, you know, who can speak for the district on, but on the other hand,
It's been adopted.
it's been adopted. I also think, I mean, again, these are things that can be addressed through policy. It doesn't have to be, what you don't want is board members undermining each other when they're speaking about something that's adopted. Anybody can reference what's adopted, in my view. And so, you know, honestly, I haven't seen this be a major problem. So I'm trying to think about this in terms of what I've seen that works. And you all are spokespeople for what's been adopted. I think it's that extrapolation. You know, sometimes it's in the context of a crisis where you need one spokesperson who's going to speak to the media, but even then, it's going to be based on action items and nothing else.
In our case, absent one, I hope that's something that we are going to use as a banner going forward. And I would hope all of us would be behind that and speak to that in the sense of we're going to have a mission. It's going to be guided towards the betterment of our system. And that's all our meetings are going to reflect that agenda.
Right, right. You know, this might be a really good, interesting thing to look at, because we've got, you know, kind of what most policies say. And what I'm hearing you all say is, but if our comments align with the action item, then why can't we have 5 ambassadors of that? And so there may be a way to reconcile the ethics piece, which is designed to prevent undermining, or design, like even in the example that I gave, there was no action item. I mean, I think that's the biggest problem in these things, is sometimes there's chaos because there's been sort of this everybody thinks that we're all in agreement about something, and then everybody walks away with their perception of that agreement. They may not even be trying to undermine, but the truth is no action was even taken to point to. And so to me, the discipline is more along the specificity of the agenda, including what action the board might take, and then an action item that's clear enough that it's known to all 5 board members and the public and the administration, starting with the superintendent, what action was taken. And so I think cleaning those things up, where I see some of those risks and flaws occur, is the lack of specificity and the lack of discipline in the meeting itself. And then that oftentimes leads to the erosion and lack of discipline outside of the meeting. So my bigger concern is the discipline in the meeting than what happens in the ways that you all described. The newspaper wants to, have you talk about your passion for solar energy, and you're excited that that's part of what just got passed by the district. It would be weird to say, well, I can't talk about it, only the board president can. It doesn't make sense.
So I had a question, like, our school board email is accessible to anyone. So say somebody sends you a negative email, how do we handle that? Does it go to the board president? Does it go to Dr. Spoletta, or?
Right, so secretary could also, if it's a personnel matter, and of course you all know that the community thinks that you all have more authority in the area of personnel than you do. And sometimes they're sorely disappointed to find out that you don't. And I feel confident that even the new board members already know that they don't. And so if it's a personnel matter, then, and there again, discipline. And I know it can seem at first like, well, I'm going to insult my constituents who thought that I could get something done. You want to get disciplined with your constituents to, number one, when they say, well, I'm going to tell you this in confidence, to tell them no, it doesn't work that way. That if you have a concern that you want to tell me about, I'm not going to promise you that I can keep it confidential. And that you have a chain of command, that there are limits on your authority, and you have a chain of command. And so if it's outside of your authority, then all you can tell them that you're going to do is refer it to the superintendent. And I would not promise them confidentiality. But out of that, honestly, becomes the sense that you're doing it because you care and respect them and the process. And so when they begin to realize that this is for everybody's own good, because if you're walking around with a bunch of confidences, it may actually create some legal obligation, whether it be Title IX and a Title IX investigation, something that might lead the superintendent to have to make, an ethics complaint against somebody's license. You can't deprive him of information. And so you want upfront for those constituents to know what the parameters, your ethical parameters. And when you let them know that it's for their own good, it's for everybody's own good, then I think they'll come to understand it that way.
What about whistleblower protection?
So you can absolutely assure them of the protections for whistleblowers, but that doesn't assure anonymity. And so what it assures is through the process, they can't be retaliated against for what they've complained about. And so now if the complaint is, superintendent is engaged in serious wrongdoing, then you got to look at the policy itself for what do you do with that, because that's your one employee. But anybody lower in the chain of command, the superintendent's got his obligations under the Whistleblower Protection Act and whatever other whistleblower, sometimes people use that more broadly than the law does, but type protections you've built into your policy. The superintendent is under that obligation as well. And so when you want to assure them that your superintendent understands those obligations and is going to be mindful of how to maneuver through the situation and protect them to the maximum degree possible. But whistleblower does not mean right to anonymity. Because the truth is, at some point in many circumstances, you can't both fulfill your obligation to investigate, your due process obligations that you may have to all parties to ultimately get at the truth and get at accountability and responsibility and safety, and keep that individual anonymous. So, and I've been in that role of investigator, which, you know, is a rare role for me because I'm usually in the role of advocacy for the district, which typically means the board, but or you know, each situation is different. But what I just want to say is that anonymity to get through a proper investigation is very hard to do. Okay. So I'm going to hit a little bit on privilege. Do not reveal the substance of the communication with the school's attorney without board action approving the waiver of the privilege. This is really, really important for the system to work the way it's intended to be able to get reliable, good, sound legal advice, and then be able to navigate based on that. So here's a hypothetical. The superintendent asks the district's legal counsel for an opinion regarding whether the district's website, which was developed and is maintained by a third party, complies with the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehab Act. The attorney writes a letter that is shared with the board, which states her belief that the website is not accessible and gives recommendations for dealing with the concern. At the next board meeting, when the motion to terminate the third-party contract fails, one board member complains that the board is not following the advice of legal counsel and reveals the contents of the letter. You can't use legal advice. Once you are saying we're doing this based on legal advice, you run the risk that then the advice itself is that you're not going to be able to preserve the privilege. So you accept that advice, and then you decide ultimately, I mean, the decision is ultimately on, if it's a board, within board authority, on the board to make a decision. If it's, you know, a decision in the personnel area and on the superintendent to make that decision. But you want to be very careful in terms of how, whether at all, and how you would communicate about lawyers. That communication has to stay confidential unless it's waived.
I have a question. So if we say we're doing this based off legal advice, does that open up the legal advice to ICRA?
It potentially does. And so my preference is that stay very clean and sharp. Yeah. Now, when you go into executive session for matters, and I'm going to hit some of those matters in this PowerPoint, matters that Open Meetings Act allows you to go into executive session to have legal advice. There's a record that you got legal advice. But that doesn't mean that you would in any way say we're acting on it, or this is because our lawyer told it. And people think, okay, that's why you hire lawyers, is to be able to say, well, we're doing this because our lawyer told us to do it. But in this very complicated realm of privilege, if you're going to say that's your reason for doing what you did, then that potentially opens up, it does open up a legitimate argument, whether it's been waived and that there's some entitlement to know what that advice was. It does at least open up that legitimate discussion.
It's kind of counterintuitive because it seems like that's a shield. People bring that up as a shield, but it's actually exposure.
Exactly. It is very counterintuitive. It's very counterintuitive. So number 5 will get us into when we can go into executive session without your attorney to discuss pending or going into executive session with an attorney. And then also number 5 is do not meet in executive session without your attorney and discuss pending litigation. And in this hypothetical, the possibility of settlement. So there's your hypothetical. They're going to discuss the possibility of settlement on an identified case. The board goes into executive session and discusses the litigation without its attorney. So the exception itself, here's the language straight out of the statute. Meetings subject to the attorney-client privilege pertaining to threatened or pending litigation in which the public body is or may become a participant. So it's what you're in there for is the communication that is considered privileged. There's otherwise no reason to be in there under that exception. So here's the guide that explains it. Now, they do acknowledge that in certain limited circumstances, you might have the letter from the attorney that is their legal advice. And so that's their voice. And maybe, you know, the superintendent is bringing that letter in and you're talking about it without the attorney there. But that, the Attorney General says in the guide, should be rare. Because really the idea is that's where you are having that communication of that give and take that is all privileged. The purpose of the exception is for the conversation itself. And it's hard to say that you were engaged in that conversation if the attorney's not there. Again, the exception, the rare exception might be that you've got a comprehensive letter and the letter is the voice. But it's to receive and communicate regarding legal advice. So that raises the other question that I want to hit that's addressed by the Attorney General, because all, you know, states are different on this. I can tell you that in other states, in the other state I've practiced in, which is Texas, and they have, or they did, I don't know what it is now because I haven't looked at their OMA in many, many years, but they did allow for any communications that were attorney-client privilege to be executive session communications. But in New Mexico, it's limited to pending or threatened litigation. There's a whole lot of communication that goes on between district and school attorney, board attorney, that's not pending or threatened litigation. And so in the compliance guide, the Attorney General speaks to that and says that you either have to hold those discussions in open. So sometimes it is in open. Maybe it's a policy and the board wants to understand that policy and there's nothing you're trying to protect and you do want to rely on it. You want to understand, for example, let's say you're trying to develop a policy for accessibility, website accessibility, which was that hypothetical. And you're wanting to hear publicly from your lawyer what those parameters are. This isn't an individual claimant. There's no threatened litigation. You're just wanting to set up a system. You could have, and I attend board meetings for that purpose. Right now, we're in an open session. And I'm speaking generally about these issues and talking about the legal requirements and ways to accomplish that. And it's public. So it can be that context. And there's nothing protected. It's not a privileged conversation at that point. There are other ways too. And so what it says here is, for example, let's see, the public body will either have to hold discussions with its attorney in an open meeting or rely on other means. So what are those other means? For example, the attorney might communicate with each member of the public body individually through one-on-one conversations or letters. Now that sounds like a rolling quorum, right? And that's why I wanted to quote, I didn't want you quoting me. I wanted you to quote the guide, because what you see in this is, keep in mind, however, and this is part of the quote, that if the attorney's advice is discussed among the quorum, in person, by email, by telephone, or otherwise, then you've got a problem. Then you've got a rolling quorum. But if I'm speaking to Board Member Dean, and then Secretary Murillo, and then Board President Guadiana, and then Board Member Begay, and then Secretary Gracias, and because I'm communicating to each of you about some work that I'm doing, and advice, and responding, you know, I don't even want to think of a hypothetical right now about what that context might be, but each of you, so that you know what's going on, and you're not communicating with one another, then that's not a rolling quorum. As long as I'm not saying, and I spoke to President Guadiana and he's concerned about XYZ. If I'm doing that, then I'm facilitating that rolling quorum. And so it's either you all doing it or my facilitation of it, and then we would have a problem. And so those one-way communications are okay. There's also other times, and I can tell you because I'm in those board meetings as well, other exceptions that sometimes apply Well, your lawyer can go in and give you legal advice in executive session. That's the entire board, and it's not pending or threatened litigation. So for example, let's say that it's limited personnel matters. I frequently, for example, facilitate the board's evaluation of the superintendent, where I come in and actually facilitate your process of completing that evaluation, working with each of you individually, and then in the collective to help your voices be one voice rather than 5 different voices. And so I'm in there giving you legal advice, but not under the pending or threatened litigation. I'm in there under limited personnel matters, specifically the evaluation of the superintendent. It may be, for example, that there's a high profile employee investigation going on, and Dr. Spalletta wants the board to understand, first of all, something about the investigation, something about the process, and also as a heads up, maybe it's hitting the news or might hit the news, and also wants you to understand what your role is in that context. Again, it can be listed as limited personnel matter, and in those situations, what I like it to say is so that the superintendent can discuss or inform. So the superintendent can inform and legal counsel can advise regarding limited personnel matter, specifically investigation of a certified employee.
And you have a list of suggested language that we
Yes,
can use.
yeah, I can work with you all on examples. The other thing is a student matter. So sometimes there's been a student matter. So student matter, personally identifiable information regarding a student is an exception. Dr. Spalletta may want me, maybe there's been, again, a situation, an investigation, the board, Dr. Spalletta wants to inform, Dr. Spalletta wants to make sure you all understand the legal implications of this. It's not pending litigation, it's not threatened litigation, but it's personally identifiable information regarding an individual student. You could have a board or an attorney in the executive session advising on that. Real property is another one. We're in executive session advising on that, but it's not under the pending or threatened litigation. It's under the real property exception. So does that make sense? Okay. Do not take any action in an executive session, including through a polling of the board. Now, I'm not going to get into too much nuance on this. This is the general rule. There is some nuance because of a court decision having to do with settlement when you're in there working out litigation strategy. But that, first of all, you wouldn't be doing that without your attorney in there. And so I'm going to set that aside. So this is the general rule. So here's my hypothetical. Board properly notices that we'll go into closed session to discuss evaluation of the superintendent. This is actually kind of kind of one of those that seems like common sense until you think about it carefully. The board president prepares written directives to accompany the evaluation, and the board discusses the directives in the executive session. The board president then polls each board member to determine whether they are in agreement with the directives as written. After a majority approves, the board president invites the superintendent into the executive session to review the evaluation results, including the written directives. Now, how I like to approach this to keep it clean is that the board goes through in executive session. Sometimes it takes 2 sessions. And I always tell the superintendent, that's a good thing because you want your board all giving you this, as clear and as hopefully united a feedback, a voice to the superintendent. So it may take 2 executive sessions where you work through what that evaluation should say and any goals, any directives, any expectations that you want to deliver. So you work that out as a document, and then you go out when you think you've got it as gelled as it's going to get, and you go out into open, and these would be action items that you would also list in open, and that's to approve the evaluation of the superintendent as prepared in executive session. And so then you go out into open. You don't disclose its contents because those are matters of opinion in a personnel file that are protected and not public record under the Inspection of Public Records Act, right? And so you would go into open, not reveal its content, entertain a motion to approve the evaluation, including written goals or whatever it is, that it was prepared in executive session for the superintendent, it's approved. The minute it has at least 3 votes, the minute it has a majority vote, then it becomes the board's evaluation of the superintendent. It becomes the board's written expectations, whether you were in the 2 that didn't vote for it or not. That is the board's evaluation. It's not the majority's evaluation, it's the board's evaluation. But you don't really know that until that vote is taken, right? And so that's why on things like that, the cleanest thing is go out, get it approved. Now, sometimes the superintendent will say, but wait a minute, I didn't get input on that, and I might be able to provide a perspective on one item that they just completely didn't understand or whatever. I have had boards after doing that and then getting the input of the superintendent, going back out and amending it. That's okay. But the idea is that whole thing, and that's why I was saying earlier, really the whole speaking for the board. If you have clarity within your process of agenda and action item about what that voice is, then there's less concern about confusion about what you say when you get out there, right? Because you've been disciplined and clear about that. So anyway, I'm probably saying more than y'all need me to at this stage, but so there's the limited personnel matters exception. I wanted you to be aware of the exact language there and what the subsection is. And so here I give my much briefer commentary on how to do it right. Do not reveal limited personnel matters discussed in executive session, including information protected by IPRA. The good news is I just shared all of that. So I'm not going to go through the hypothetical example. But what you don't want to do in this hypothetical, again, I try and give you hypotheticals that match what I think a lot of board members think is common sense, and then show you why your common sense can get you in trouble. So here it's a board member feeling compelled to explain his vote. And starts talking about vote in terms of the superintendent selection, starts talking about and comparing the letters of reference of the finalists. The letters of reference are protected under IPRA. And so, you don't want to be discussing that. So here's some IPRA exceptions that I wanted you to be aware of, because again, IPRA and OMA, not necessarily precisely because they serve somewhat different purposes. Not everything protected under IPRA has some sort of counterpart OMA exception for executive, but you definitely see the intent when it comes to personnel. And then I wanted you to see, again, I thought this was your policy. I'm guessing that your policy has something similar, but your duty of confidentiality under Nmsba policy. Okay, collective bargaining. You all are a collective bargaining district, right? And so this can get tricky too, but do not reveal collective bargaining strategies discussed in closed session. And that actually, of course, closed session is always confidential, but this has additional legal reasons why that has to remain confidential. So I included here, again, I think a sympathetic example. I try to give you sympathetic examples. After meeting an executive session regarding collective bargaining strategies, a board member expresses her frustration in open session that the plan is to give no more than 2% raises. You've not only created a problem in terms of violating your confidentiality obligations under board ethics, et cetera, but the PEBA, the Public Employee Bargaining Act, also by law requires that there be confidentiality around bargaining. And part of it is also this interesting, I think it's actually fascinating from a public policy standpoint, but dance between you don't want to do anything that undermines the relationship in the union relationship. So their team and their membership has their dance and their process. And when you're violating confidentiality and crossing that line, you're potentially engaging in bad faith negotiating because you're publishing directly to their members things about the bargaining process that is not your position to share. It's for them to share it with their membership, what they're going to release about strategy and how they're going to approach those things. And then the board to confidentially, with its authorized representatives, have its strategy discussions. So you have to be very careful because there's that interaction between PIBA and Open Meetings Act that go hand in hand, which is why under Open Meetings Act, you can go into executive session to discuss bargaining strategy because it's confidential by law under PIBA.
So the board can engage in strategy sessions for the negotiations.
You're not on the team, but you can have the team, like your team lead. What I'm used to, and I know Dr. Spalletta, you're familiar with it too, because you've been in other union districts, but you can have your bargaining team lead come in and share with the board where they're going, kind of how it's developing, get some feedback. Now, again, that feedback isn't an override. Ultimately, your voice is at the very end when you ratify it or not.
Yes.
What would be our reason for going into executive session?
To discuss the strategy. So it's
For negotiation.
for negotiation. So what you typically have in districts, what I like to see is all along, so there aren't surprises and there isn't some kind of a, oh my God, this is not right, which is a horrible position to be in. It's it undermines, the whole relationship is that the team lead is coming in preliminary to before bargaining even begins, and then throughout the bargaining process to say, here's where we're at. That though is a sacred conversation. It's a valuable conversation. You will oftentimes hear from the union if it's difficult negotiations. Oh, well, your administration isn't telling you the truth about what they're doing in there or whatever, but you can't engage in that. Once bargaining starts, there's a wall, and that's where too your whole kind of constituent role and your interview with the newspaper and all that. I mean, you are walled off. You can't do anything that has you personally as an individual board member or out on the dais commenting during bargaining, but you can receive updates and within that executive session have some dialogue. This is where we're at. This is what we've shown them. They're frustrated because they think that these numbers are more flexible, and answer you all's questions and give some feedback and help kind of guide that strategy.
Okay.
It leads to a healthier conclusion. It really does.
Otherwise, we could get to the end where it's like, no, that's not.
And it's totally demoralizing for the bargaining team.
That I can see.
Totally demoralizing. And can put you in, time dilemmas and all kinds of dilemmas. So I wanted you really to see that whole where confidentiality and OMA intersects with the Public Employees Bargaining Act to understand that piece. Do not discuss anything beyond what has been properly noticed for executive session. I will tell you that when I'm in board meetings, and I think my boards who know me know it's not personal, but I will even sometimes in open, okay, we're off topic. I mean, sometimes I will jump in if I'm there, but in executive, if I'm there, I'm very much, just like, no, and some board presidents just know, like they'll look at me and I'll look at the board president and then like, okay, we stop that. It is sometimes hard to figure out because there can be some related pieces, but you really have to be, and this is why specificity of the agenda in terms of the exception you're going in on, again, that's part of the discipline, and it helps you absolutely know what the parameters are of that discussion, and you have to stay within those parameters. Now, for example, sometimes a superintendent may want to update the board on an employee reassignment, and it's to talk about the individual employee. Maybe there's going to be some reaction in the community, and the superintendent, it's not to ask the board their opinion, right? Because that's not your role. But at some point, you're going to be evaluating your superintendent on how, in this case, he performs his personnel functions. And that's not to influence his individual decisions, but you're looking at him as a manager of people, because that's one of his primary jobs. And so a superintendent who, you know, in my view, a wise thing for the superintendent to do is give you insight all along into how you manage people. And there's two ways to do it. One is an executive session if he's updating you on a specific individual, and then the other is an open session if he's updating you on system changes, a new I blanked out on the term, but the diagram of who does what.
Org chart.
Yes, org chart, thank you. It's been a really long day, a really long day. The org chart. And so a lot of superintendents will say, well, you know, can I talk about the org chart out in open? Absolutely. That's a wonderful opportunity, not only to impress your board on how you're organizing in a way that makes sense, but also as a sales pitch to the community. There's nothing wrong with those discussions. So when you're in limited personnel matters, you're only there because of a privacy interest in the individual employee. And so the minute that discussion goes into, and because of that, we're reworking our org charts out there. Okay, we're done. We've talked about the individual. Well, if it's not on the agenda for this meeting, fine, get it on the next one. We'll hear about all of your new system for how we're going to handle this problem that we've now, that, you know, maybe came as a result of an individual employee, but now we've got a new system that's going to fix this going forward for everybody. The fix going forward for everybody is open session. And the truth is, when you get really comfortable with transparency, the board gets comfortable with transparency, the superintendent gets comfortable with transparency, then you end up being way more effective with the public, because the public trusts you and sees your transparency. And, you know, you're a public body, you're a governmental entity. And so really there's a lot more that has to be out in the sunshine than in a private business. And that takes a while to get comfortable with. Okay, so I'm going to skip the hypothetical because I think I've made that point. I do like to do reports on closed executive session as part of the agenda after you've done the executive session. So where does that come from, and what do I mean by that? And are you all, I don't know that you've had many executives, but okay, so let me just talk to you briefly about this. So what the statute says, what OMA says, is following completion of any closed meeting, the minutes of the open meeting that was closed, or the minutes of the next open meeting if the closed meeting was separately scheduled, and I can talk about standalones if you need me to, or we can do that some other time, shall state that the matters discussed in the closed meeting were limited only to those specified in the motion for closure or in the notice of the separate closed meeting. This statement shall be approved by the public body under subsection G of this section as part of the minutes. So I have some boards where they don't ever say anything about whether their discussion was limited. It just shows up automatically in the minutes, and technically when they approve the minutes, they're approving the statement. But to me, it makes more sense to affirm that so that, one, it ensures it gets in the minutes, and then it's a public affirmation, which helps ensure that we're all keeping ourselves in check. And so
the minutes shouldn't include something that wasn't done.
Wasn't said, exactly. So it's a weird, but if you look at the language, you can see how that is. And so what I like to do, and I've given you in the guide, I won't read it to you, the rationale. It says, including the required statement in their minutes, will remind public bodies that there are only a few proper justifications for closure, blah, blah, blah. Helps you resist temptation. Well, I don't think it should just be in the minutes. As President Guadiana just said, I feel the same way. And so what I like to do is, after a closed, either if it's a standalone closed, which you all may never have had, but if it's a standalone closed, then your report would be at the next open. Or if it's an open, you voted to go into closed, you came back out, then you would do it in that coming back out. I like it as, for me, I always put it as the next agenda item after the closed session. So you've got your closed session and your legal basis for the closed session. And then if that's letter E, then letter F is report on closed executive session. I have a script. I can share that with you all, but a script on that report that literally affirms that we went in for this reason. And the board president then says, and I affirm that the matters discussed were limited to those as stated. And so when you know you're going to have to walk out as board president and affirm that, you're going to keep everybody in line. So I think a lot of this is about discipline. Refrain from discussing public business when gathering outside a meeting. And I think you always have to be mindful that when a quorum is seen visiting with each other, and there are times when you, even in your official hat, you're at a graduation, you're all there officially. And so you're going to be chatting with one another. You need to be aware that that can lead to suspicion. And so I did include an OMA letter from the Attorney General, an OMA opinion letter. And what I like about it, this one, is that the Attorney General acknowledges that it can appear suspicious, and you just have to be mindful of that in your conduct. But you can be friends. You can be physically present in the same place. You can attend, events together. You just have to be mindful.
We need to have a public notice for that.
No, and
We've done some recently, actually.
I don't like them. Let me tell you why. And this is just my opinion. So some districts do what they call quorum notices. And so it almost it can create resentment on the part of the board, because it's like, do I really have to report, every place I may be going to? It almost sometimes can create even its own rolling quorum. Well, you're going to be there? Oh, because we got to go report it. So there can be a quorum notice put out. So one of the reasons I don't like it is because it creates that weird dynamic of having to report all of your, where you might be or what you think you might attend to administration so that they can get it up. The other problem I have with it is, even if you're doing it, it doesn't comply with OMA. It's not an agenda that's specified more than 72 hours. If it's a special board meeting, it's not noticed. All it is telling the public that you might be here in a number of 3 or more, and you're not there for the purpose of discussing public business, which doesn't guarantee you won't. So I just think it's important that you all be mindful. And again, I didn't read the quotes from this letter, but take time to read it and be mindful of your behavior. But I think that that quorum notice can create this weird sort of policing thing on the one end of the continuum, and on the other end, it can create a false sense of security.
And, recently we had a meeting, where there was a workshop being conducted about reunification. And I had called the board members because that required us to change the time. And some of the board members says, yes, I'm going to be attending that. Please do change the time of our meeting, our subsequent meeting. And I knew that there was going to be at least 3 there, and I thought, oh, that's kind of problematic. And so I didn't attend because I didn't want to add to that.
Yeah.
And so it seems like that was not necessary.
I don't think it was necessary. Now, I do kind of struggle with when you're so let's say you've got an advisory committee, and the superintendent really wants to make sure that it's a dynamic committee. It's the superintendent basically setting all that up, but wants to give you all the experience of seeing what's happening in the dynamics of that. I kind of struggle with, and I played with some policy approaches to that. If you go, you got to make sure again that you're not giving voice to policy opinions that lead that group into a discussion with the quorum of the board about policy issues when it's not. It may be an open meeting in terms of the superintendent's invited anybody who's interested in the community, but it's not an OMA public meeting. So you do have to be very careful when you're attending school functions. The graduation, you're not up there doing any policy discussion. You want to be careful, especially if there's a quorum of the board.
The reunification one kind of falls into a real gray area because we're talking about where our students are going to be relocated, and they probably want us to participate in that discussion.
Then I would consider, town hall meetings can be tricky from an OMA standpoint, but if you're trying to set up, and I'd have to know more, and we don't have to get into all the details now, but I have looked at those and looked at structuring them as actual OMA meetings.
So I am doing some things here next month. I can invite all board members to town hall to understand this community.
I think what we would want to look at is if it's ultimately a board decision in the board's lane and not the superintendent's lane, then we may, and you and I can talk about it later, and certainly we can, pull President Guadiana in terms of structuring the agenda, which I do want to bring that up at some point in terms of your current policies don't really address who sets agenda. And I know that, unless I haven't found it, I know that Mr. Guillen brought up exactly what I've seen in all policies, that there's usually language that may have other ways that address how board members get something on the agenda if you're not the president. And then by default, the president's role and the superintendent's role in agenda setting. But I'm not seeing it in your existing policies.
There isn't, been denied a number of
Well, I
times.
don't want to get into
No,
that,
but so.
but in terms of the agenda or the policy language, if you're not making a switch over to Nmsba soon, you probably need to take a look at that as a policy, something in your policies, because you need that. So, because I'm even finding myself operating under the assumption that the board president and superintendent is who I would discuss agenda setting with. And I believe Ms. Dean has a comment.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Hi, this is just kind of off. I mean, it's kind of the same line. So what if all of us just wanted to have dinner together as friends? Is that a huge no-no?
The Attorney General has acknowledged that you all can be friends. And so, but that requires a huge amount of discipline. When you go to Nmsba, when you go to conferences, it's very common that you'll all end up at dinner together. And so you just have to remind each other, all right, guys, where are we going on vacation? Where is each of us going on vacation? And how do we, and when everybody knows that, oh yeah, we're going to say this and we're going to remind each other several times, it's not a huge no-no. Now, what's hard is if you've got people, I've seen, if you've got constituents that are, believing that you all are engaging in inappropriate conduct, then you're going to have to explain a picture of all of you around the dinner table, but it isn't per se a violation of OMA that all 5 of you or 3 of you are around the dinner table together. I might take all 5 of you out to dinner sometime. It's not an OMA violation inherently. It's just something, again, you got to look at.
Maybe give a letter, I guess.
But, and maybe we can get ahead of that by saying that in the public meetings that are putting OMA as part of the agenda and saying that it is appropriate for us to do this so long as we do not.
So very good point. I have written into the OMA resolution a paragraph from this guidance. And if you remind me, Dr. Spalletta, I can send it to you. I think I put it in the resolution, a paragraph that says just that. You can socialize, you can be friends. It takes the place of this quote unquote quorum notice. I actually, I had people are so matter of fact with me that, oh yes, quorum notices, we do this. But if you go into Attorney General opinions, OMA commentary, there's nothing in the law, the compliance guide, that makes reference to quorum notices. And so, if you want to do them and if everybody believes in it and they like that structure and discipline, you can, but it's going to hang you up sometime. Yeah. You're going to end up all somewhere and you're going to be in this awkward situation of going, okay, which one of us has to leave? When you're legitimately there
or go to the, like, so whether I'm not going because I know 3 other members are going. So I'm gonna refrain.
Summerfest, convocation, all of those things.
Yeah.
Unless we announce it. We were thinking that that's the responsibility. If we know, if we anticipate we're gonna be there, we need to announce it. And so that if it will be.
I think that a paragraph in your resolution will go a long way. So anyway, you can try that. And again, there may be local norms and other reasons. Everything you do has a risk the other way, right? And so it's part of it is weighing that for your local community. And obviously, as you can tell by the way I'm talking, I don't think there's one right way. And every way has a pro and a con. And I think the important thing is for you all to be aware of what those pros and cons are, and then put it into policy how you're going to approach it. That language can also show up in policy. You put into policy how you're going to approach it. It comes from authority. It doesn't come from Elena Gallegos. It comes from, Attorney General guidance, and then follow it.
A good question, Lisa.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you.
So I just wanted you to see in general the purpose of OMA, and I think that it's really helpful for you to go back, like when in doubt, just go back to the fundamental purpose of OMA, which is that sunshine law that requires that public business be conducted in full public view. The actions of public bodies be taken openly, and here's that rest of it, President Guadiana, that I was just mentioning, and that the deliberations of public bodies be open to the public. That all of that is sacred. And I think when you can treat it as sacred, you'll be nothing but successful. So here's just more on OMA and the action piece of that. Official acts for purposes of OMA include informal acts by a public body in the course of official business, such as the acts of deliberation, discussion, and deciding occurring prior and leading up to affirmative formal action. Now, this was a 2010 letter from the Attorney General, but I think that is really powerful. I think that goes beyond, and again, you can find in the compliance guide statements that suggest, well, if no action was taken, it could be discussed, but this says, it absolutely has to be discussed in open. But my concern is when the public didn't even know you were going to be talking about it, and it's a high profile issue, and they're looking at the agenda. They don't see it there. Well, it turns out it came about because of some stir in public comment, but nobody else got to be there and know. And so it's just, if you treat the discussion is as sacred in terms of public knowledge, public notice, public ability to therefore come and observe as you do action, I think that you'll be a stronger, better, healthier board. So what is a rolling quorum? I think just from your nods, you have a pretty good idea of it, but it's important to remember it can come through in lots of ways. Telephone, email conversations, any discussions. And so you can't assume when you start talking to one board member that they haven't talked to somebody else about that same thing. So you really want to be careful. But it is a conversation by a quorum. So conversation between two is not a quorum, but if either of those two go talk to a third, then you've got that rolling quorum, even though maybe the one did not intend the other to go talk to a third. So you've got to be incredibly careful in that regard. I do want to say in terms of emails that one-way communication from your superintendent to you, I already gave you an example of one, the actual acknowledged by the Attorney General, one-way communication from your lawyer to you is not a rolling quorum. What superintendent needs to be aware of is any emails he sends to you giving you, oh, heads up, we have this parent who's griping at us again, and boy, look out for her and go running if you see her in the Walmart. That could be subject to a FERPA request by that parent to have access to any emails that reference, her as a parent or her and her child, and could end up, even though it was legitimately sent to you, it's not protected in terms of student record, if it's a student record, it's not protected, or that scenario would be protected as a public record in all likelihood. But the superintendent needs to be aware that just because he's communicating with you one way in what he considers confidential, it may not be confidential. And so he has to be really careful about those one-ways. What I like to do with one-ways, when I'm giving legal advice and sending a one-way, I know that's protected under privilege. What I like to do is so that you all know that you're all 5 getting it from me, if I'm including all 5 of you, is I'll BCC all of you, but then I will put in the content, Dear President Guadiana and members of the board, and then I'll put in parentheses BCC'd, and then at the top, all board members BCC'd in order to avoid an inadvertent rolling quorum. So that it's not like, oh, who got this? Then you're not having to call each other.
Could you say that one more time? I didn't get all of that.
So you would say, and you could do this in your communications, is you would say, you know, how I do it is Dear President Guadiana and members of the board, and then I put in parentheses BCC, and then at the top, I put in asterisks on both sides, I put board members BCC to avoid an inadvertent rolling quorum, because you're not going to do it on purpose. Where the inadvertent comes in is if I list you in the 2 and you reply to all, oh, that's crap, or oh, I don't agree with that. Now we've got a rolling quorum because everybody knows now that you think it's crap or that you don't agree with it. And so a BCC allows you then only to reply to the sender, or maybe if I've included the superintendent in the CC, it allows you to reply to the superintendent and me, but you're not replying to one another. And so it just avoids that sometimes knee jerk to hit reply to all and reply.
So if I'm going to ask for, you know, before I meet with Superintendent Spoletta, that board members, you guys have any items that you want to be put in the agenda so we can have that discussion, I would use that route, or I shouldn't do that?
You could use that route. You could absolutely use that route. The other thing too is I think receiving an item for the agenda, if you're not discussing the content, you're just receiving the item for the agenda. I don't think that's, and again, we need to clean it up.
That was my perception, but then the reality is everybody sees it then.
Yeah, but you don't want the reply to all. Yeah, so that's what I would do. I would do that. It's just say, you know, mind or deadline. If you want something on the agenda, I need to know by X date. Or you could have, you know, Dr. Spoletta could have his assistant do that, but I think you certainly could do that. That would be a way to handle that. Okay, so any questions about rolling quorum? I feel like you guys understand it. Any questions about rolling quorum? I've actually had to sort of demonstrate to people sometimes, you know, because it's easy to have happen. But I think we've kind of talked about it in its various forms.
I think we understand it, right?
Yeah. Now, we're in another meeting. You can ask that question.
That's an example of what you
Okay. Well, I know it's late and it has been a long day probably for all of us, but what a privilege to get to be here. So thank you for that privilege, and I'm available as you need me.
Can I have your card so I can send you an email with some of the information that someone's going to provide regarding?
I don't, I will get this PowerPoint to you. I don't have any cards with me.
Okay.
I don't believe, but there's my email address, and I'm going to get this PowerPoint to you. Dr. Spoletta, if you don't mind just doing a reminder and copying the camera, because I make all kinds of promises and an in-service that I forget I do.
The other stuff.
Send that where it gives all your profiles.
Yeah, it was on our other board meeting in the packet.
Yeah.
That packet on.
Yeah. That's true.
Oh, good.
Yeah, you sent us that.
Oh, that's right. I forget. Y'all were talking about us last time.
And you'll provide us with the script for public comment?
Yeah, are you using any at all? Okay, and we're probably gonna need to pull your policy to see, because the script will need to align with the policy. And if the policy is lacking in terms of, you know, what you ultimately want to accomplish, we could, you know, certainly you all could look at adding to that policy. Because I wouldn't want to do it. I have seen situations where the script and the policy don't match. You know, the script's going to need to align to the policy. But yeah, I'm happy to send you.
Dr. Did you discuss the 4 reasons that you could go into executive session?
There's more than 4. But yeah, we did talk about when attorneys end up mostly in executive, but, there's, your common ones are limited personnel, property, pending or threatened litigation, person identifiable student information. Those are the ones that are the most common. And so, and I have told, I have mentioned too, and we'll state it here, that sometimes you'll go in on more than one. Oh, collective bargaining is the other one. So collective bargaining strategy. But you might go into a situation where it might be an employee and student. It might be a limited personnel matter, but that employee is threatening litigation. So it's limited personnel matter and threatened litigation. It might be a situation where, you know, a student has made a claim against an employee and is threatening litigation. So it's actually 3 exceptions, because you're gonna have your lawyer. Now remember, you're not gonna be in there under that 3rd exception unless your lawyer is communicating with you in a privileged manner. But if your lawyer is communicating with you in a privileged manner, it might be all 3 exceptions. And so in those situations, then I say you list all 3. So you need to be in there at least under 1. And I don't think it would be a violation if you listed 1 and everything you talked about fell under the umbrella of the 1. My concern would be if it really is a personnel matter and you've listed it as a student matter, it would be hard to probably talk about the whole breadth of the personnel matter under only a student item. So that's why I look at if it is obviously more than 1 to go ahead and list those. You could have your attorney in there talking about the personnel and student matter without necessarily having to list it as threatened litigation. But I like to, when the attorney's in there, say, you know, as I indicated earlier, superintendent will update the board or inform the board, and legal counsel will advise. So we've got a record that there was privileged communication in there, that you were getting legal advice. It's also a good reminder to the board members, legal advice, got to keep that confidential. Okay. Thank you.
You're driving back tonight, or you're?
I'm driving to a district down south, so I just have about an hour and a half, 2-hour drive. It's not all the way to Albuquerque, and it's not that highway that was beautiful. The Gila was absolutely gorgeous. It was a spiritual experience driving up here yesterday. But no, going back, I was worried. I thought if I had to go back, I would be uncomfortable at this hour. But I'm not. I'm going on a major highway heading back. So
Last school board association meeting, drove there going and then couldn't drive there coming back because the smoke from the fires was affecting that, and that was like not there.
And, and I could see the trees, but it's so green because of the monsoons that you all have had. They really show, and so it wasn't even clear how fresh that fire was because there was so much green around it.
There's been several fires, so.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, but it was absolutely a beautiful drive yesterday. So, okay, thank you. I'm gonna pack up. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's an honor.
Okay, so I need to, we concluded the training sessions, and we're at the point of adjournment. So if I have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
We're adjourned. Okay.